choice. If you know, Cindy Hyde-Smith or Roger Marshall or Jerry Moran want to send back a blue slip that says don't, you know, I don't support this candidate, Dick Durbin has a choice. He can take that blue slip seriously and veto that candidate and not send their nomination to the floor of the Senate. Or he can say, okay, cool, you don't like this person, I'll append a note to our recommending this to the entire Senate for a vote. He's choosing to allow Republicans to cancel, to veto Democratic nominees. Now, what is this whole blue slip thing? Where did this start? Where did this come from? It started, the backstory here starts in 1789. On August 3rd, 1789, President George Washington sent a list of people who, these were officer commissions. Those are also being held up in the Senate right now. They require senatorial approval for a different reason and in a different way. But in any case, George Washington sent a list of naval officers to the Senate, and you know, for the home state senators, each state had 2 senators, still does, for the home state senators to say yes or no to these people. Now, the reason they did this was because if you're George Washington living in Washington, D.C. or Mount Vernon, Virginia, you know, or you're the senator from Massachusetts, or you're the senator from Connecticut, you have no way of knowing in 1789 who this guy is, Benjamin Fishburne of Georgia, who the president has nominated for, you know, a military promotion or for a judgeship. You just have no way of knowing. There was no internet, there's no Wikipedia, there's no mass media. They hadn't even invented the telegraph at that point. There were no national newspapers. So it made perfect sense that if you're the president or if you're other senators, that when a nominee is brought forward from, you know, a state, that you would go to the 2 senators from that state and say, what do you think of this guy? Is he any good? Or is he, you know, a nut job? Is he a drunk? Is he a felon? Is he just a general ass? Should we be considering him or not? And if one of the home state senators says no, then, you know, don't advance that, you know, out of an abundance of caution, don't advance that nomination. And in fact, what happened was Senator James Gunn of Georgia objected to Benjamin Fishburne being nominated by George Washington for this military promotion. Now, the reason he objected was because Fishburne had supported Senator Gunn's opponent, Major General Nathaniel Greene, in a duel, or a duel that Gunn had challenged Greene to. Gunn walked around for a whole year with a pistol in his belt because he kept hoping that he would run into Greene so he could shoot him. And Fishburne had publicly, you know, basically ridiculed Gunn for this attempted duel. So Gunn vetoed Fishburne. Now, George Washington was seriously pissed off about this. He walked over to the Senate chamber and confronted Gunn and said, why are you doing this? Why are you vetoing my nominee? And Gunn said, under the debate, under the consent and advice clause, the advice and consent clause of the Constitution, it's my obligation to advise and consent or withhold my consent. I'm withholding my consent and I'm giving you advice. Don't give this guy a military commission. And Washington said, why? And Senator Gunn said, I don't have to tell you. The advice and consent clause does not require me to give you a reason. Now, because you're the president and because I respect you, I will tell you my reason. My reason is I don't like this guy. But I don't have an obligation to tell you. And that incident in August of 1789 established the precedent that today we refer to as blue slips. And from 1789 up until around 1917, a paper would be distributed from the president about his nominees, and home state senators could object, and generally speaking, the Senate Judiciary Committee respected those objections and didn't let those nominees out, didn't let them go to the floor of the Senate for a vote. Now, this is not a law. It's not even in the Constitution. The Constitution does not mention anything about this. This is a tradition. It's not even a Senate rule. It's a tradition. There's nothing binding to this. In 1917, 105 years ago, Congress tweaked it a little bit. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee, they started passing out that letter saying, what do you think about this guy? Printed on a blue piece of paper. And if it was returned with a no, now starting in 1917, see, this was when radio had become a thing. There were now two national radio networks, the Red Network and the Blue Network, which ultimately became CBS and NBC. And there were nationwide newspapers by 1917. So people knew who people were. And so in 1917, they stopped vetoing people, even when they were objected to by the home state senators. And they simply noted, when they passed that nomination along to the floor of the Senate, simply noted, hey, one of the home state senators says don't vote for this guy. You know, which would hurt, but it wasn't a veto. And that stood from 1917, where they did it on blue pieces of paper and they started referring to it as blue slips. That stood until 1955, when Senator James Eastland, the notorious white supremacist, became chair of the Judiciary Committee. Now, 2 years earlier, in 1954, the Supreme Court had ordered public schools to be desegregated, to be integrated racially. And Eastland wanted to make sure that no federal judge would be appointed to the bench, to the federal bench, who would support the Supreme Court's decision in that regard. And so he went back to saying, if a home state senator suspects that one of these judicial nominees might support the Supreme Court's integration order, we will respect that as a veto in the committee. So from 1956 until 1979, while James Eastland was head of the committee, if somebody blue slipped a nominee, if they said no on a blue slip to the nominee, that nominee was toast. It never got out of committee. Now in 1979, Ted Kennedy came along. He replaced Eastland, and he said, no, we're going to go back to the way it was before 1955. We'll simply tell people somebody objected, but it won't kill the nomination. In 2001, though, Orrin Hatch became the chair, and he went back to James Eastland's rule. And Pat Leahy, when he became the chair in 2003, he followed Eastland's rule, which provoked a 2014 outraged op-ed in the New York Times, official editorial in the New York Times, calling out Leahy for doing this. Now, then in 2019, Lindsey Graham becomes chairman, and he says, we're going to ignore blue slips from Democrats. And that's how they push through a lot of these crazy Republicans that are on the bench right now. They just ignored the Democrats' blue slips. Well, now the head of the Judiciary Committee is Dick Durbin, the senator from Illinois. And he's gone back to doing what James Eastland was doing, Republicans to veto Democratic nominees simply because they feel like it. So I'm encouraging people to reach out to Dick Durbin, particularly if you live in Illinois. I was not able to reach any of his offices yesterday. Nobody answered the phone at any of them. But, you know, if you live in the state, maybe they'll answer your phone. Maybe they'll recognize your phone number. Or you can email them. You know, there's other ways to contact the senator. You can tweet him. Let him know what you think about this. I think this is just a travesty. Our book today is Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee. This is from the first chapter, Jailbreak Out of History, Harriet. Focus on Amazons, about why we deal with real women as myths, girls who never really existed. Yet and again, all are around us, and that we can't bring ourselves to see. Because seeing through white men's eyes is about non-vision of ourselves. So let's deal with a real Amazon. Think about Harriet Tubman. Take 6 months. In fact, take a year and think. Break it on down. What does it mean to be the most famous new African woman in U.S. history? What does it mean to be stuck in that lie? What's the meaning of being famous while being hidden and disfigured and dissed? Let's jailbreak Harriet Tubman out of white history and place her in Amazon and new African, her story, her people's story. Harriet Tubman's life is a live weapon placed in our minds, showing us what it means to be an Amazon, which is why the capitalist patriarchy has forbidden us to touch on it for so long. In this, maybe for the first time, we can see Amazons as a future force in a clash of peoples and nations, not as myths, but as players in the whole difficult course of world politics. We can also appreciate the bittersweet tang of reality as the peeling away of layers of propaganda and disfigurement which have hidden Harriet from us exposes how much we assume and how little we have known. New African women have already pointed out the significant pattern of Harriet's exclusion. Cultural critic Bell Hooks said recently, if we could recover Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman to the extent that we've recovered, say, Zora Neale Hurston, I think that's an important contrast because people want to bury that revolutionary black female history. Historian Deborah Gray White connects Harriet's treatment to a larger pattern in the mainstream history of slavery, in which black women, quote, were reduced to insignificance and largely ignored, end quote. In examining the influential historian Stanley Elkins, she points out, quote, that Elkins seems to omit women altogether was accentuated by his description of slaves whom he identified as part of an American underground, those who never succumbed to Samboism. Among those mentioned were Gabriel, who led the revolt of 1820, Denmark Vesey, leading spirit of the 1822 plot at Charleston, and Nat Turner, an omission conspicuous by its absence, was Harriet Tubman. If Elkins had really been thinking of slaves of both sexes, he would hardly have forgotten this woman, who became widely known as the Moses of her people, end of quote. Patriarchal capitalisms, which only want Amazons to be exotic myths about forgotten ages, have hidden Harriet Tubman in her own fame. They both trivialize and exceptionalize her. These are tools of oppressor culture. The stripped down and censored version of her life is told in elementary schools all over the U.S. empire. So much so that everyone thinks they know her story already, although they don't. Harriet Tubman was born in slavery in Maryland around 1820. She escaped to the North when she was 29, but kept returning secretly to the South again and again to help other slaves escape. For this, she became known as Moses. True statements. But by limiting her, it becomes clever propaganda against her and against her people. Where patriarchy has been unable to deny that women do significant things, it denies the full meaning of what we do by trivializing them. Mary Daly, feminist philosopher, traces the enormity of what patriarchy has done to us. In ancient Greece, the goddess Hecate, also known as Artemis and Diana, was sometimes known as represented by a three-faced statue. That was also the name used for the intersection of three paths, which in many old cultures were the sites of mystical power. She writes in Gynecology, quote, in light of the cosmic significance of the term trivia as the crossing of the three roads and of the goddess who bears this name, contemporary meaning of the term in English should be examined. The English term, which according to Merriam-Webster is derived from the Latin trivium or crossroads, is defined as common, ordinary, commonplace, of little worth or importance, insignificant, flimsy, minor, or slight. Of course, according to patriarchal values, that which is commonplace is of little worth. For in a competitive hierarchical society, scarcity is intrinsic to worth. Thus, gold is more important than fresh air, and consequently, we are forced to live in a world in which gold is easier to find than pure air, end quote. So to trivialize Harriet Tubman, the capitalist patriarchy pictures her as an idealized woman by their definition, who makes a life of helping others. Thus, her deeds are squeezed into women's assigned maternal role as nurturer, helper, and rescuer of men, who then go on to do important things. But Harriet wasn't repping Mother Teresa. She wasn't even any kind of civilian at all. She was a combatant, a guerrilla, a warrior carrying pistol and rifle, fighting in her people's long war for freedom. Foundations of African society, American society, and that has never gone away. Think about what it means to be called Moses, which was the code name other new Africans gave her, and which became Harriet's famous warrior name in the anti-slavery underground. When we check out the Bible, we can see that Moses was a ruthless visionary, someone who forced the boldest changes and risks upon his people so that they could survive, who led them out of captivity. To put it simply, Moses was a leader in a time of war. So too was Harriet Tubman. The book Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Hey, happy Thursday. A lot going on in the world today that we're going to talk about. We've got a lot on the program. Two guests, in fact. I'll tell you about that in a second. First of all, I want to get into the secret plan to break the independent spirit of the Supreme Court. This was something that Alexander Hamilton laid out back in the day. Also, China agrees with DeSantis and a few other states that library books should not have unhealthy ideas. What's unhealthy? Well, whatever the dictator decides. We'll get into that in this first hour. Also, in the first hour of the program, speaking of China, a comedy company got a $2 million fine for a military joke. Is this going to give DeSantis some ideas for his next steps? In the second hour of our program, Phil Ittner is going to drop by, the veteran war correspondent based in Kyiv, Ukraine. After that, I have just a heartbreaking, heart-touching story. A little bit of humanity. It's the war in Ukraine that I want to share with you. And can gerrymandering get worse? The Supreme Court looks like it's preparing to make it far worse. We'll talk about that in the second hour of the program. In the third hour of our program, Alex Lawson is going to drop by from Social Security Works to talk about the impact on Social Security and Medicare of a possible debt ceiling breach. And we have two geeky sciences. An amazing new transition to electric vehicles is speeding up. This is incredibly good news. And also in the third hour, Geeky Science number 2, why our modern lifestyle is causing our brains to shrink and what you can do about it for yourself. I mean, it's not a particularly big deal to do something about this. It's really some amazing new research. But let me start out with the secret plan to break the independent spirit of the Supreme Court. Back in the day, in Federalist number 78, Alexander Hamilton wrote at some length, the Federalist Papers were a series of newspaper articles that were published mostly in the summer and fall of 1787 and through 1788. In the fall and winter of 1787 and throughout 1788, that were basically sales pitches to the states to ratify the Constitution, which happened in 1789, and that's when we officially became the modern United States of America, and George Washington got elected, and the Supreme Court was created, and all that kind of, by Congress, and all that kind of stuff. It's interesting, by the way, the Supreme Court did not exist at the creation of our country. The Constitution does not create a Supreme Court. Article 3 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to create the Supreme Court, which they did, which I find fascinating. In any case, Alexander Hamilton argued strongly, and it's in the Constitution, I mean, he argued successfully as well, that Supreme Court justices should be on the court for life. He calls it permanency in office. And he said the reason why, well, he said nothing can contribute so much to the court's firmness and independence as permanency in office. This quality may therefore be justly regarded as an indispensable ingredient in its constitution, and in a great measure as the citadel of the public justice and the public security. He goes on to say, if then the courts of justice are to be considered as the bulwarks of a limited constitution against legislative encroachments, this consideration will afford a strong argument for the permanent tenure of judicial offices. since nothing will contribute so much as this to that independent spirit in the judges, which must be essential to the faithful performance of so arduous a duty. The whole point, in other words, was if we give judges lifetime tenure, so they no longer have to rely on a political party, they no longer have to rely on political donors, they no longer have to rely on the support of partisan newspapers, then they will do what they believe is right, rather than what, helps their friends or helps them or helps their political party. And by the way, that's how it was right up until pretty much the Reagan era. For example, I give a couple of examples in the article. The first one is Earl Warren. Earl Warren was the vice presidential candidate on the Thomas Dewey ticket running against Harry Truman in 1948. Most people probably, are not old enough to even remember that, but most people don't even realize Earl Warren was, ran for vice president of the United States on the Republican ticket. Before that, he had been the 3-term governor of California. Very, very popular governor. Before that, he was California's attorney general, and he was a complete hard ass. He was a total law and order guy. He was a lifelong Republican. He was the Republican governor of California. And before he was the attorney general, he was the district attorney for Alameda County, where he delighted in throwing people in jail. He had a reputation as being a really tough, very conservative prosecutor. That was Earl Warren. So, and in fact, Richard Nixon, in the 1952 Republican nominating convention, Richard Nixon, then the senator from California, put in the nomination of Earl Warren for president. Now, it ended up going to Eisenhower. Eisenhower, won the election of '52 with Nixon as his vice president. But everybody agreed Earl Warren was one tough, law and order, right-wing Republican. So, that was Eisenhower's first appointment to the Supreme Court, was Earl Warren. Let's put this guy on the court. He's a forceful law and order guy. And what happens? Well, the first major decision that came before the court in 1953, the ruling was, issued in the spring of 54, was Brown versus Board of Education. And in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court and Earl Warren, there were only 2 dissenters in this case. It was a 7-2 decision. And Earl Warren got basically the whole court to go along with him and say, yeah, we can no longer have racially segregated public schools in America. Thus began the whole charter school thing, the whole private school thing, the whole Christian academy thing, and also, Fred Koch, the father of David and Charles Koch, who was a big patron of the John Birch Society, helped fund, Save Our Republic, Impeach Earl Warren posters, billboards all across America. But, that didn't stop Earl Warren. That was 1954. Then, following that, he recognized the right to privacy. It had never been acknowledged in the history of the United States under the Fourth Amendment. He recognized that and struck down the Connecticut law. This was in the Griswold case, struck down the Connecticut law, making it illegal to possess birth control in Connecticut, including condoms. Then in the Engel versus Vitale case, he eliminated prayer in public schools. Then in the Miranda case, he said that you have the right not to speak to police and they can't beat a confession out of you. Then in the Gideon v. Wainwright case, he said you have the right to a free defense lawyer. I mean, every single one of these cases just made conservatives and Republicans just go nuts, right? And then after that, he struck down laws against interracial marriage. That was the Loving v. Virginia case. He ended in a form of extreme gerrymandering. They used to say, okay, this little county with just a few people in it gets one representative, and this huge county with lots of people in it gets another representative. And Earl Warren and the court said, no, you have to have equal numbers of people. In other words, once he became independent, he became a liberal, or at least what conservatives would define as a liberal. I'd say a constitutionalist. The same thing happened with William J. Brennan, who was, another conservative. He was a staunch Catholic. He was confirmed by every Republican in the Senate except for Joe McCarthy. He'd never been a politician, but his judicial record was really tough. He was so conservative that the National Liberal League, which was the largest organization of liberals and progressives in the nation back in the day, vigorously opposed his nomination. And Eisenhower thought, oh yeah, if the National Liberty League hates this guy, I love him. He puts Brennan on the court, and Brennan again becomes one of the most liberal justices. Then Jerry Ford nominates John Paul Stevens in 1975. John Paul Stevens, famously dissented to Citizens United, famously dissented to Bush v. Gore. Again, became, and in fact, he wrote the Chevron versus NRDC case, which is where the Chevron deference came out of, which I talked about last week. This is the doctrine that the Supreme Court created that said that, if a regulatory agency hires scientists and comes up with something and says this is how it should be, then that's how it should be. The court should defer to them. Thus, the deference. So yeah, John Paul Stevens. And then of course, finally, George Herbert Walker Bush put David Souter on the bench. And David Souter, who John Sununu, the Republican governor of New Hampshire, which is where Souter was from, said it'll be a home run for conservatives. And what did Souter do? Well, he voted in Planned Parenthood versus Casey in favor of abortion rights for women. And he joined John Paul Stevens in opposing the court's handing the 2000 election to George W. Bush, even though he lost the election by 500,000 votes. So what happened was after these four guys got on the court, the billionaire class, the right-wing billionaires, were like, we can't let this happen again. And they started pouring money into the Federalist Society and other groups that would make sure that judges were genuine conservatives. Now, all these guys were actually genuine conservatives at the time they were put on the bench. But more importantly, that once people get on the bench, that there would be a steady, regular, daily, weekly, monthly, whatever flow of money to them. John Roberts' wife made over $10 million. Amy Coney Barrett's husband's law firm is now booming, and he's getting rich off it. Sam Alito travels to Europe for luxury trips and gets huge speaking fees. And, don't get me started on Clarence Thomas. Make sure that there's a steady flow of money and gifts to these guys to keep them conservative. And this has corrupted the court. And the corrupted court is now corrupting American democracy. So we've got to do something about this. I think the things we have to do are fairly straightforward. We need to, number one, we need to expand the court. Number two, we need to make exceptions to what the court can rule on to basically reverse Citizens United and say corporations aren't people. We need to do something about the shadow docket. I mean, there's a bunch of things that can be done. But, as Adam Schiff said, our nation's highest court is not a conservative court because a conservative court would have respect for precedent, and this court doesn't. This is a radical, reactionary court. And Congress needs to do something about it. Obviously, it's not going to happen this year, but we need to get ready for after the next election.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is a Paul Revere moment. Spread the word. Democrats and progressives need to get ready for the possibility that we can do this after the 2024 election. And welcome back. Alfredo watching Free Speech TV in Mountain View, California. Hey, Alfredo, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. How are you? Thank you for taking my call. Yeah, regarding the Supreme Court, I think the Biden administration made a big error by not expanding the Supreme Court. My biggest fear is that on the next election, we're going to have another Bush v. Gore in steroids. They're going to challenge the election if the Republicans lose, and it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and they're going to hand this, presidential election to the Republican candidate, possibly Trump. And I take my comments off the air, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Alfredo. I am concerned, as you are. This court, is right-wing and reactionary, and Bush v. Gore set a precedent, even though in their decision they tried to say, this is not precedent, don't quote us. And then, they went on to quote themselves multiple times since then. So, yeah, I think it's a legitimate fear. And the solution to it is to make sure that our victory in 2024 is so large, so massive, so overwhelming that even the Supreme Court can't say, well, we're not really sure, so we'll just give it to the Republican, like they did in 2000 with Bush v. Gore. I just don't see an alternative. I really think Neil Howe has a new book. It'll be out in July called The Fourth Turning is Here. And I think it is. I think we're going to have an overwhelming victory, but we'll see. We'll see. Terry in Rochester, Washington. Hey, Terry, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. I'm, talking about the Supreme Court. I've never heard you bring up William O. Douglas under Kennedy. Mm-hmm. He wrote a book called Points of Rebellion. The right would really freak out if they started reading that.
Really? I've not read that book. I'm a big fan of Douglas. I didn't mention him because he wasn't appointed by a Republican president, but continue.
So he wrote Points of Rebellion. From what's going on now, it's way past the point where we should be rebelling, basically, what he was saying. I mean, everything the right is doing, all this illegal, unconstitutional, racist, fascist leanings, or if you want to call it leaning, it looks like they're heavily into it now, and they've been trying it for the last 50 years or so. But I'm a Vietnam veteran, so sometimes I say, geez, was I fighting for the wrong side? Like Ho Chi Minh said, sometimes the Statue of Liberty seems like it's standing on its head.
Yeah.
But
so what did Douglas say in his book? Was it that at a certain point Americans should rebel, or that we should be in the streets, or
Right, exactly. What you just said, exactly. We should be rebelling right now.
Did he give specific things that we should rebel about or against?
Yeah, I mean, the things you wouldn't even believe that are going on now. I mean, just everything. The crooked Supreme Court, the way Congress is being run, the way the oligarchs have gained control of the whole situation here. It's how a guy like me that's making barely take home $38,000 a year has to pay $200 a month for income tax on my and a little pension.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Terry. Good to hear from you. I've got to track that book down. Thank you for the tip on that. I appreciate it. We'll be back. It's, 22 minutes past the hour. Stay tuned. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. We tend to think that this blood-soaked moment in American history is unique, with all these mass shootings and school shootings. And in some ways it is. Mass shootings and school shootings are relatively new phenomena in the American landscape. But back in the 1930s, at least the early 1930s, we had a very analogous situation with armed gangs, roaming through our streets and just killing people indiscriminately. We still remember a lot of their names. It was Bonnie and Clyde and Machine Gun Kelly and John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson and Pretty Boy Floyd and Ma Barker and Al Capone. And the country said enough. They were all using fully automatic weapons. We passed a law in 1934, the National Firearms Act. Didn't outlaw them, just put a tax on them, and that was the end of that. I'm suggesting we should extend that tax to all semi-automatic weapons. There's a whole rant about it at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. And welcome back. So, wow, what Republicans have wrought, right? Hath wrought. Well, first of all, news from Hong Kong. Hong Kong is now under the control of China. And John Lee is the chief executive of Hong Kong, kind of the mayor of Hong Kong or the governor of Hong Kong. And he said this morning that they are starting to remove library books. They contain what he referred to as unhealthy ideas. Unhealthy ideas. Right. So put that in your biocomputer, one data point. China just started censoring books from their libraries in Hong Kong because they have unhealthy ideas. Now, here's this piece in today's Washington Post by Hannah Nathanson. Librarians could face years of imprisonment and tens of thousands in fines by providing, quote, harmful books under new state laws. At least 7 states have passed such laws in the last 2 years, 6 of them in the past 2 months. Another dozen states are considering more than 20 similar laws like this. In Arkansas, teachers can get, and public librarians can get up to 6 years in prison if upset parents find a book they don't like in the library, right? If they distribute what are called, quote, harmful texts. Right, that's Arkansas. In Indiana, it's 2.5 years in prison for a harmful material, quote, harmful to minors. In Oklahoma, 10 years in prison for harmful material. In Tennessee, 6 years in prison and fines up to $100,000 for harmful material in the schools. In every case but one, and that was Missouri, and they got 1 Democrat to sign on to that bill, but in every case but one, Republican lawmakers or Republican-dominated committees introduced the laws. Idaho State Representative Jaron Crane, he's the author of one of these bills, he says, if teachers and librarians are scared to do their jobs, that confirms the fact that there is indeed material in their libraries that is harmful to minors. In other words, we're going to threaten you with prison if we find a book that we don't like in your library, and the fact that you are threatened with prison is proof that you've got bad books. Man, this is just nuts. Just nuts. Meanwhile, speaking of China, well, I'll get to that right after the break, and then I'll pick up your phone calls. It's 27 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann program, occupying the media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right here. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann program. Call 202-808-90.
Fair and only slightly unbalanced. I'll be right back. Our Thom Hartmann University book review
Today in the Thom Hartmann
Book Club,
today.
we're featuring The Inner Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. It's a new book. The subtitle is How More Equal Societies Reduce Stress, Restore Sanity, and Improve Everyone's Well-Being. This is in Chapter 6, The Misconception of Meritocracy, page 161. Boris Johnson, the former mayor of London who became Foreign Secretary in Theresa May's Conservative government in 2016, was educated at Eton and Oxford. Giving the Margaret Thatcher lecture to a think tank in 2013, he articulated the view that economic equality will never be possible because some people are simply too stupid to catch up with the rest of society. Quote, whatever you may think of the value of IQ tests to a conversation about equality, that as many as 16% of our species have an IQ below 85, he said. Comparing society to a box of cornflakes, he praised inequality for creating the conditions under which they quote, the harder you shake the pack, the easier cornflakes to get to the top, end quote. Inequality, quote, is essential for the spirit of envy and keeping up with the Joneses that is, like greed, a valuable spur to economic activity. Whether or not Johnson is quite as clever a cornflake as he presumably likes to think, he certainly is not in command of the facts. Nobel Prize-winning economists, as well as the OECD and IMF, have shown how inequality, far from spurring on economic growth, leads to stagnation and instability. Social mobility is reduced where income, and far from inspiring innovation, it turns out that there are actually slightly more patents granted per head of population in more equal countries. And as we've seen in the previous chapters, there's also the undeniable human cost of our fixation with keeping up with the Joneses. But Boris and his misconceptions about the relationships between inequality and ability. The idea that people are naturally endowed with differences in ability, intelligence, or talent, and that those differences then determine how far up the social level is a powerful popular justification for social hierarchy. The presumption is the autocracy, in which the key to status is ability. We think of society as shaped like a pyramid. The supposition is that most people are near the bottom or only a little above it because the bulk of the population lack the special talents that we imagine people need to get to the top. And ability are the main influence on where people end up on the social ladder is so strong that we tend to judge everyone's personal worth, ability, and intelligence by their position in society. Nor is this confined simply to how we judge others. It also affects how people see themselves. Those at the top often believe that they're there because they are naturally endowed with plenty of the right stuff, just as many of those near the bottom think that this reflects a lack of ability. That picture, however, is not supported by the latest scientific evidence. First, research now shows that a very major part of what happens to people and where they end up is the result of totally unpredictable influences and occurrences amounting to pure luck. Second, aside from luck, the most important links that exist between ability and status operate in the opposite direction of that imagined by most people. Rather than different endowments of talents determining position in the hierarchy, it's much nearer the truth to say that position in the hierarchy determines abilities, interests, and talents. But let's address luck first. Whether or not we consider ourselves successful, most of us can probably look back across our own life histories and recognize the roles that luck and chance have played in getting us to where we are. We're perhaps lucky with schools or teachers, with the questions on an important exam, with some nameless person dealing with university applications, or we got on well with an interviewer when applying for a job. Perhaps a chance meeting was important, or perhaps an opportunity for promotion came up unexpectedly. Finding a life partner is just as important for our quality of life as our career or income, but we are far happier to acknowledge that chance and luck played a key role in meeting that person than we are in acknowledging luck's role in our career. No one minds mentioning the chance meeting, the circumstances that put you both at ease with each other, or the shared interest that might easily have gone unrecognized. The role of chance makes people's lives highly unpredictable. Although there are huge social class biases in social mobility, there are at the same time vast numbers of people moving up or down the social ladder in ways that even the most detailed analysis of parenting and ability fail to predict. Similarly, although there are differences of perhaps 10 years in the average life expectancy of upper and lower social classes, that explains very little of the individual differences in how long people live. Inevitably, some rich people will die young, and some people live in poverty to a great age. And as some public health mavericks used to say, even if you exercised, ate healthy, and didn't smoke, your most likely cause of death was still heart disease. In addition to all this, there may be a large element of chance in whatever our experiences, including subjective experiences, trigger the kind of epigenetic changes affecting subsequent development that we discussed in the last chapter. Just as the development of weather systems is sometimes said to be so chaotic it can be changed by the flapping of a butterfly's wings, so what amounts to chance events at the social or the cellular level are now thought to play a very substantial part in our lives. So much so that scientists have worried that if random chance and luck are such important determinants of whether or not an individual becomes sick, gets or has a good marriage, it becomes difficult to understand causal pathways at all and to do anything about preventing or remedying bad outcomes. The book, The Inner Level by Wilkinson and Pickett. Welcome back. All right, we were talking about China pulling books off the shelves in Hong Kong, just like Republicans are pulling books off the shelves in, 6 or 7 states now, and another 20 states looking at it. This Dateline China, Shanghai, China China on Wednesday slapped one of the country's best-known comedy companies with a $2.3 million fine, accusing it of, quote, harming society after they made a joke about their military. In the joke, the comedian recounted seeing two stray dogs he'd adopted chase a squirrel and said it reminded him of the phrase, have a good work style, be able to fight and win battles, which is like the slogan of the Chinese army that Xi Jinping used in 2013 to praise the army's work ethic. The incident has strongly divided the Chinese public over what sort of jokes are inappropriate as stand-up comedy becomes increasingly popular. Interesting to watch. There was a fascinating op-ed in the it was in the New York Times yesterday, I believe, about what Americans don't understand about China. I don't recall who wrote it. It might have been Thomas Edsel, but I'm not sure. Anyway, you can easily find it in the New York Times. And in this op-ed, they pointed out that in China, in America, we value very, very highly individual freedom. It's inculcated into us virtually from birth. In China, they value social stability and not letting people fall through the social safety net, as it were. In fact, they talked about how China seeks to have an olive-shaped economy, narrow at the top and bottom, wide in the middle. In other words, a large middle class. And in fact, China's middle class is larger than the entire populace. Here in the United States, we've pursued the exact opposite. We've pursued wealth at the top, massive wealth at the top, and massive poverty at the bottom, and a shrinking middle class since Reaganomics, neoliberalism, was imposed on us in 1981. We've seen since, prior to Reagan, well, when Reagan was sworn into office in January of 1981, about 60%, a little over 60% of Americans were solidly in the middle class. Today, that's down to 45%. Reaganomics have gutted the American middle class, So, anyhow, let's pick up your phone calls here. Rex in Newark, Delaware. Hey, Rex, thanks for listening to Sirius XM. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, how you doing today?
Good. What's up?
Yeah, I want to talk about abortion.
Go for it.
I've been watching a lot of Fox News with a big bottle of Pepto-Bismol, and the only thing, they seem to talk about is the great replacement theory.
They're talking. I thought that was Tucker's little hobby horse. Are other people on Fox? They're still talking about it?
Oh, yeah.
Wow, that is so racist.
Right, and I think the great replacement theory is geared towards white women instead of women of color. Because I think these Republicans can care less about a woman of color having a baby because of the great replacement theory. I think they want to block white women from getting an abortion.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We have to be strong.
Absolutely. The movement against abortion has always had basically two legs. One are the religious, believers, the Catholics and some evangelical Protestants who are opposed to abortion. And the other is the white supremacist movement, who is concerned about white babies being aborted. And for people who don't know what we're talking about here, Rex, the great replacement theory is something that's been around for a long, long time in the fever swamps of Nazis and anti-Semites, and it argues that wealthy Jews are funding basically various programs and systems in American society to cause black people to have more children and to cause more and more brown and black people to migrate into the United States, specifically to replace white people. And the goal is ultimately to replace white people as the majority population in the United States. And therefore, killing black people is justified. I mean, the murder of Hispanics down in El Paso, the murder of black people in that supermarket, the top supermarket, the murder of Jews in the Tree of Life synagogue. All of those things were justified, according to the shooters, by the great replacement theory. Back to you, Rex.
Okay, if they want to ban abortion, let's have them ban all these ED medications like Viagra, Cialis, and all of them.
There you go. Yes, I'm with you. It's so weird that the Supreme Court. I don't know if you caught this. The Fifth Circuit Court. The Judge Kaczmarek, this right-wing judge who was appointed by Donald Trump, ruled that mifepristone, the drug that is used for medication abortions, safely by millions and millions of women over the years, and was approved by the FDA 20 years ago. He says this needs to be banned. And in fact, all drugs that can cause an abortion need to be banned because of the Comstock Act, which goes back to the 1920s. And that case is being appealed before the Fifth Circuit. On the Fifth Circuit is a judge by the last name of Ho. I'm forgetting his first name. And he was the guy who swore in Kaczmarek. They're good buddies. And he's also actually he might be a George Bush appointee. But anyhow, he's a Republican appointee. And he's a right-wing whack job. And yesterday when they were hearing the appeal of Kaczmarek's ruling, he was making all these smart-ass remarks. It sure looks like the Fifth Circuit. It's all, two of the judges are Trump appointees and one is a George W. Bush appointee. And it looks like these three judges on the Fifth Circuit are probably going to uphold Kaczmarek's nationwide ban of mifepristone. And then, of course, it'll go to the Supreme Court, and it'll be real interesting to see what happens. But you're absolutely right, Rex, about the Great Replacement Theory. I'm astonished that they're still talking about it on Fox News. Well, not astonished. Yeah, I get it. Rex,
we have to get it. We have to get out there with these women protesting. They need men and women out there. We got to step up for our women.
I agree. We need to be their allies. Rex, thank you. Thank you very much.
That's right. These are our women, and we need to step up for them.
There you go. Thank you very much. Jan in Spokane, Washington. Hey, Jan, what's on your mind today?
Well, I got several things. First of all, yes, the Great Replacement Theory is ongoing, and it's strong. China, I guess we're going to have to watch them go through their own Lenny Bruce and George Carlin.
Yes. I'm not sure they're going to let it happen. We'll see.
I doubt it, too, but, that's what it's going to take. I'm a huge fan of John Perkins. Another thing came up about Kootenai County libraries. Check out Kootenai County, Idaho, and what's happening in their libraries as of today. The main thing I wanted to talk about, though, is you wrote a piece on Donald Trump possibly being a Russian agent.
Yeah, asset, yes.
And I have been trying to draw attention to something for several years now. Early on in his presidency, I think it was in like the first year of his presidency, and he was at some kind of a state dinner. I think it was possibly a G20. And the video that I saw shows him sitting at this table, and he's trying to get the attention of somebody down at the far end of the table, possibly Melania and Putin, because that's who's sitting down at the far end of the table, is Melania Trump and Vladimir Putin. And he's acting like a first grader trying to get the attention of his best friend across the class.
Wow.
Pointing his finger, trying to go, hey, psst, psst, like that, just like a kid.
Yeah.
And then the camera panned down to Melania and Putin. And they are sitting at a 90-degree angle to each other with their knees touching nearly. And their heads are together, and they are having a very serious conversation. And Melania Trump is using her right hand to make chopping motions into her left hand to accent what she is saying to Vladimir Putin.
That's interesting. It wouldn't surprise me if she speaks Russian. I mean, Slovenia was a Soviet state, and so
I believe she was a hook. I think she was a hook, and I think she's his handler.
Well, Ivana's father, his first wife, she came out of Czechoslovakia when it was still part of Russia, or part of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And her father was a Soviet intelligence agent, and he reported to the Russians on Trump constantly.
I think she was the first hook.
Yeah.
And then he ended up divorcing her, and then they ran Melania. And I think when they saw that he had an interest in Melania, I think she's the second hook. I think because they just came out yesterday saying that they've been grooming him since 1987.
That's correct, and in fact, I write about that in my article. You know, Trump couldn't be a Russian asset, could he? And I think the Marla Maples was the weird exception, and that was just because he got her pregnant. Right. You know, but he really likes to marry women who are who are connected to the Soviet Union.
Maybe they'll keep getting put in front of him too.
Yeah. It's I think Donald Trump has been thank you, Jan. I think Donald Trump has been an agent, or an asset, rather. I don't think he's ever been an agent for these people, but I think he's been an asset for them since 1987. It's fairly clear. That was that year, by the way. He tried to run for president. He went to New Hampshire and did a rally, and he ran an ad in 3 different American newspapers saying we should dump NATO.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
I don't. Maybe he was running even as a Democrat. I'm not even sure he got partisan on that. We'll be right back. It's 45 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. David in Crescent Mills, California. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
I just was wondering how can let me turn this TV down. I'm wondering how can in 1995 I was on a computer with a young computer whiz kid, and we said some stuff about Alex Jones and we had a DVD in the computer, and we got a notice right on the screen of the computer. We will shut your computer down and possibly compromise your computer because you've said 5 bad things about a sitting president. Now, is that law been rescinded? Yeah, that happened to me, literally. Well, I'm just an old timber faller.
Yes.
I'm not
Somebody was pranking you, David. That I'm guessing. Unless
it could be, yeah.
Well, actually, it was 1995. Were you on AOL or CompuServe at that time?
I think. Well, I went on there with the Gates was the only one I knew of. That 95 Windows 95.
Yeah, because the internet was just starting to become a thing at that point. HTML didn't come out until I believe the early 90s. It might have been the late 80s. I was at a meeting in Columbus, Ohio, CompuServe meeting, where they introduced HTML for the first time to all of us. And this was in the mid-'80s. Giant screen where they said, look at this, there's it's called hypertext link, a markup language, or I think that's what HTML. And he clicks on a link and it takes you to another page, and we're all like, whoa, who wants to do that? Is this thing going to catch on? And of course it did, HTML is still kind of the language of the internet. But I think somebody was punking you, David. But
okay, yeah, I just wonder though, how has things got so rotten that every program that I turn to, if I turn to a Democratic program, I hear that what's going on, and then I turn to a Republican program, and they're just bashing the sitting president, and they're not even being classy about it at all.
No, well, that's free speech. Terrible, John Adams got so upset about that back in 1798 that he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he put 20 newspaper publishers in prison. And he shut down their newspapers because they said things he didn't like about him. So this is nothing new. It's just that we need to be tolerant of it. David, thank you for the call. Terry in Ventura, California. Hey, Terry, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. Hey, a quick humorous aside. My main topic is book banning, but I think it's funny. I think it was an Al Smith Award, and a black humorist was saying the real issue with abortion, the real issue is that white men aren't blanking enough. Okay.
Okay.
And that has to do with replacement theory. But my topic, Tom, is book banning, and you really hit my interest. Okay, let's say when Ron DeSantis sends me to his re-education camps, I ask, what book would you take if he allows me to take only one book? And that book would be The People's History of the United States by Zinn.
Right.
And why would that be banned? You go to their section on Jim Crow. It is so well documented.
Oh, yeah.
And
That's a brilliant book.
They have tried to ban the Zen book in a couple states, mostly Indiana, okay?
Wow, I didn't know that. It makes perfect sense, though. Terry, thank you. Thanks for the heads up on that. That's amazing. It's 49 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting progressive talk radio, and tag you're it. So back in the 1980s, Louise and I lived in Germany for a year, and one of the stories that I remember hearing from some of the older people who were there in Stadtsteinach, who had been alive during the Hitler era, was that the radio and television stations, well, they didn't have television stations, but the radio stations and the newspapers back then had, on radio, it was a particular time of the day, and in newspapers, a particular part of the paper, where people could write in or people could call in and denounce their neighbors for being gay or for being disloyal or for being secretly Jewish. And that would then cause the neighbors to all go after them because it was a matter of public record. Now, anything states do in the United States is a matter of public record. The Attorney General of Missouri, Andrew Bailey, has just put up a form on the government's website, the Transgender Center Concerns form, where you can report your neighbors for dressing up as women. This is nuts. There's a whole long rant about this over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. Oh, welcome back. Mark in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, what's going on, man? Well, today I'm talking about the book burning.
Mm-hmm.
So what I remember in class and like history is occupying forces did that, right? Whenever they would come in, they would destroy everything that everyone would, whatever they were.
Well, that's what happened to the library at Alexandria. But the book bans initially it was book bans, and then about a year later it became book burning in Germany. It was done by the government itself, the Nazi government.
Right. So why don't we start calling the Republicans what they are, an occupying force? Like, why don't we just start putting it out there?
It feels like that on some days, doesn't it?
I mean, that's what they've become. I mean, they're literally just trying to turn it into some kind of religious state that no one really wants.
Yeah.
And that's what we should start calling them, an occupying force.
It really,
they just occupiers.
It really is. I agree with you. It really is troubling. Thank you for the call and making that point. Another Mark, this Mark in Portland, Oregon. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hey, I just had a question about the Arkansas's laws to ban certain books. I mean, what's to stop teachers from saying, "Now, kids, I don't want you to go on the internet and read this book. I don't want you to do that." It seems like there would be...
They might get reported to a hysterical parent who would then go to the school board to, with hysterical right-wingers and try to get that teacher fired. I mean, if you were a teacher and, the pay isn't even all that spectacular. I mean, if you were a teacher and this was your job and your career and your entire future and you spent years in college getting ready for it and it was something you wanted to do your whole life, would you risk all that by saying that to a student?
Well, I guess what I would say then is, there's always the internet if you can't check books out of the library.
Yeah.
That's what I would probably tell students.
Yeah.
And then, I just find it incredible that what's Arkansas going to do? Put filters on the internet for certain books in Arkansas that they can't get online? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, that would be millions of dollars of trying to create a filter that would go after subjective, arbitrary lists of books.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, the goal isn't to completely eliminate these books. It's to make them more difficult to get. And the fact of the matter is, most students, if the book isn't in the school library, if the teacher can't provide the book, they're not going to jump through all the hoops of, going to Amazon or Powell's Books or something online and ordering it. They don't even have dad's credit card, or mom's credit card for that matter. So I think these bans are going to be quite effective. Yeah, it's
I wonder if they could teach a class. I wonder if they could teach a class about the history of banning books in America. I wonder if they could teach that class.
That's a good question. That's a very good question. Mark, thank you. Thank you for the call. Dennis in Aptos, California. Hey, Dennis, what's up?
Yeah, I'm just wondering why the the Judiciary Committee of the Senate, which is, we know that Durbin's in charge of that, why they haven't subpoenaed members of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, particularly Thomas.
The billionaire donor of Thomas.
Yeah.
We have Jordan throwing out subpoenas left and right, and we know that he ironically enough didn't comply with one himself.
Yeah.
And to me, it's just another sign of the Democrats, and I am a Democrat. I've been a Democrat for 4 decades. Just don't have enough spine. They don't know how to fight.
Right.
And it really ticks me off.
Yeah.
I see Schumer as like one of the, he's no better than Harry Reid.
I get it. I get it, Dennis. Have you reached out to either Schumer or to the senator from Illinois?
Durbin?
Yeah, Durbin, Dick Durbin. Thank you.
I haven't, I have to admit, and there's a reason I haven't, and it's because I've made phone calls to my own congressman, who happens to be Jimmy Panetta, on a number of issues, and again, the feedback, what I've gotten back from, and I have tried to call Congress before, and the only time I really got anywhere with anyone was with an aide for a Republican congressman that I was really able to just sound off on. This goes back probably when, it was when Trump was president.
Yeah, it had to be a while ago, because I don't think Republican congressmen, members of Congress are even answering their phones anymore. Everything goes to voicemail. That has been my experience.
Exactly, and that's what I'm afraid of. If I have
call Durbin's office.
Various senators.
Call Durbin's office. I mean, yeah. I agree with you. I think he should subpoena Thomas. But it's only been a week since Thomas and Roberts basically told him to screw off. So I'm thinking that there's a very good chance that there's going to be a subpoena coming down the road. I just, Dick Durbin is a deliberate guy. He's going to take this one step at a time. He's going to he's going to put things, get his ducks in a row and all those other cliches. So I wouldn't give up on him. Dennis, thank you for the call. Wow, a lot to talk about here. Phil Ittner is going to be with us at the top of the next hour. We'll get a live update from Ukraine, from Kyiv, Ukraine, about what's going on with the Russian terror campaign against that country. And a little bit of humanity on that war also. And can gerrymandering get worse? Stay tuned.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is by P.E. Moskowitz. It's The Case Against Free Speech, the First Amendment, Fascism, and the Future of Dissent. This is from the introduction. This book is not anti-free speech. It is anti the concept of free speech. It's an important distinction. Everyone should have the right to say what they want. I will not argue otherwise. I am not an authoritarian. In this book, I will not argue that the United States should adopt laws banning racist speech, like the ones that have proliferated throughout Europe, for example. I think those laws are often counterproductive and end up being used against leftists instead of against racists. I won't argue that Nazi speech should be outlawed as it is in Germany. I won't argue that the First Amendment should be reformed nor more firmly upheld. This book is not about whether the First Amendment is good or bad. This book is about why the First Amendment is nearly irrelevant, except in its power as a propaganda tool. In the following chapters, I will argue that free speech as a concept is meaningless, that it is a dialectical smokescreen more than an ideal to be upheld, that in a grossly unequal society, in which a few corporations control the means of media dissemination and a small group of the ultra-wealthy bankroll entire political movements, there can be no meaningful definition of free speech. On paper, I'm free to speak as a billionaire. I am as free to speak as a billionaire. Yet I do not have the power to change laws through political donations, to influence college curricula, or to quash entire movements for economic liberation. And still, I hold more speech power than most. I am a published author, and my speech is sanctified by the gatekeepers of my publishing house. Therefore, the path to free speech, I will argue, has less to do with a law about speech, or many laws, than with ending racism and inequality. Throughout U.S. history, disparate groups have claimed to cherish free speech more than their enemies. Unionists in the 1920s saw free speech as synonymous with striking and ultimately class revolution. Today, conservatives are the group to most often shroud their politics in free speech, arguing that any silencing or protesting of their speech runs counter to U.S. values of freedom and liberty for all. But as I hope to prove in this book, free speech has never really existed, because freedom and liberty have never really existed for the vast majority of Americans. Instead, this U.S. has systematically acted against those values, suppressing the opportunities, speech, movements, and actions of the masses, especially people of color and anti-capitalists, in order to favor the free flow of capital to the owning class. This oppression and suppression have been constant since the founding of this country, and therefore free speech is a hollow signifier, pointing to a past that never existed. The funny thing about free speech is that it's been used to fight for and against these liberties, both as a guise for the wealthy and powerful to oppress the poor, like the Koch brothers and their supporters using free speech to push through anti-democratic legislation and rip apart campaign finance laws, and as a rhetorical tool for the working class to further their cause, as happened in the early 1900s when leftists argued that free speech includes the freedom to riot, and the ACLU argued it was the only way to prevent a violent revolution. I don't argue that one definition of free speech is more legitimate than the other, but that they are all relatively empty signifiers, hiding more tangible structures of power and ideas underneath them. So why write a book on free speech if I think the term is essentially meaningless? Because the concept holds so much weight in our country. We argue endlessly about whether it's being trampled on, whether college students hate it, whether the government is adequately upholding it, but we rarely ask what free speech is, or how we got to the free speech crisis we supposedly face today. When you scratch the surface of conversations over free speech, you find more difficult issues underneath. It's much easier to talk about the ability of conservatives to speak on college campuses than about the systemic racism, sexism, and transphobia college students experience. And those are the things students who protest campus visits by right-wing conservatives are actually fighting against. It's easier to fantasize about a country that values free speech than to grapple with the fact that we place so much emphasis on free speech while jailing dissidents and allowing tens of millions to live in poverty. What is free speech to someone who works 60 hours a week and has no time nor any platform to use their supposed right? There is relatively little literature and philosophy on free speech, despite the fact that it has been in constant contention since the founding of this country. Even the legal history of the First Amendment is sparse for something so foundational to the values of our country. A few have seriously grappled with ideas of what free speech does and does not mean, most notably literary theorist Stanley Fish, who has argued that the term does not mean much at all. Leftists like Noam Chomsky have written about free speech tangentially in their explorations of media as a propaganda tool. Most history books on speech are written as hagiographies, unquestioning the intent of the Founding Fathers and their morals, with a few notable exceptions, such as Laura Weintraub's The Taming of Free Speech. I don't intend to fill the yawning gap of research history and philosophy. This is not a definitive account of free speech, but a necessary intervention, prodding us to be more critical of the term, and maybe along with it, of the other lofty concepts we must hold near and dear. The case against free speech.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program as I try to get my IFB working here. On the line with us is our buddy Phil Ittner, the veteran American war correspondent based in Kyiv, Ukraine. And you can find his video blog over at YouTube. His name is spelled Philip, P-H-I-L-I-P, Ittner, I-T-T-N-E-R. That's also how he spells his Twitter handle, at Philip Ittner. Hey, Phil, welcome back to the program. I understand you guys you were subject to another barrage of Russian missiles, including apparently hypersonic missiles overnight or this morning.
Yes, Wednesday into Thursday, and this was the second night of this kind of attack. Oh, by the way, it's Happy Vyshyvanka Day. That's the traditional Ukrainian embroidery. People are wearing, and I'm wearing mine. If you see me on the vlog,
I wonder. I saw Petro Poroshenko on MSNBC this morning. He was wearing a beautiful shirt under his sports coat, and I thought, wow,
it's a beautiful traditional embroidery. And in this time of war and in the kind of effort to bolster Ukrainian national identity, I've walked the streets today, and a huge percentage of the people walking the streets were wearing proudly their Vyshyvankas, and it's a beautiful traditional design. And so there you go, Tom. I'm wearing that for you.
Isn't that great?
Yes, we had an attack overnight in today. This one I slept through, but the previous one, which was Tuesday into Wednesday, which was an incredibly intense attack, in which Patriot anti-aircraft ballistic missiles were used, or the defense system was used to great effect, and it showed the Patriot missile system, which is the best anti-aircraft, defense system in the world, actually defeated a hypersonic missile system that the Russians heretofore kind of said was moved at such incredible speeds that it was unable to be shot down. Well, the Patriot missile system has just shown that that's not true. Apparently, there are serious repercussions in Russia, including some of the scientists who developed the Kinzhal hypersonic missile, which the Russians have been crowing about, including Vladimir Putin. Well, a bunch of scientists, appears, have been detained, and they might be in trouble because they made claims that were, unsubstantiated and shown to be unsubstantiated by the display of the Patriot system.
Yeah, I'm wondering how do they get these missiles? I mean, Kyiv is not anywhere near the Russian border. It's way up in the central, kind of northwestern part of the country, if my memory serves me right. Are these missiles being fired from aircraft? Are they ground launched?
They are
cruise missiles?
Well, let me correct myself. The Kinjal is, in essence, a cruise missile, a type of cruise missile that moves at hypersonic speed, and that is shot, that is dropped from an aircraft. So you've got the added distance of the aircraft. So if the aircraft can get close, penetrate Ukrainian air defenses as much as it can, and then drops the hypersonic Kinjal cruise missile, that just improves its distance. But we do know that munitions have been over the last 2 nights basically been fired at Ukraine from every single source that the Russians have. So missiles were launched from the sea, missiles were launched from the air, drones were launched from territory held by the Russians out in the Donbass or along border regions. They fired everything that they possibly could at Ukraine, and it's certainly Tuesday into Wednesday. Everything that was shot at Ukraine was blasted out of the air by defenses. Yeah. So it is an example of how incredibly talented and capable Ukrainian air defense is. And as bad as it was to have debris falling from the sky, it could have been far worse had those missiles, reached their destination because of the explosive payload. Oh, yeah. So even though it is an expense to shoot Patriot missiles at Kinjals, Patriot missiles are not cheap, but it's something you can't put a price tag on, because not only does it save lives, but it also it gives a sense of security, and it improves morale amongst the Ukrainian people to show basically the impotence of what the Russians try to do, because no matter what the Russians shoot at Ukraine, it seems like the air defense systems have gotten to such a capacity that Ukrainians are feeling, a little bit safer.
Yeah. What's I don't recall if it was a conversation I had with you a week or two ago or with somebody else, or if I just read it, but I had heard that the guy who runs Belarus, the next country over to the north of Ukraine that is now heavily aligned with Russia, had vanished had not been seen publicly for quite some time. And there was some concern that at one point, the Belarusian territory was, being used as a staging ground for the invasion of Ukraine. At other points, we had heard that is his name Lukashenko? Am I remembering right?
Lukashenko, Alexander Lukashenko. He's a terrible guy. He's often commonly referred to as the last dictator in Europe. Mm-hmm. He has brutally put down opposition marches and protests. He has locked up his opponents, his political opponents. He has killed political opponents. He has used draconian police tactics to put down marches and things like that. It's a police state. It's a dictatorship in the old Soviet style, and he's a man who has a lot of blood on his hands. He went to the May 9th Victory Day parade in Moscow, and he didn't look good. People noted that he had a bandage on his hand. Speculation is that it was to cover a bruise from maybe a drip or something that was that he was taking,
like he's on chemotherapy or something,
or some other, maybe he's he's malnourished, or any number of things. I mean, you get a drip if if you're dehydrated. You get a drip if you come out of an operation. Right. So we can't jump to chemo, but he doesn't look good. He looked puffy. He left early from the May 9th Victory Day parade, which was a catastrophe, and we talked about that last week. And then he returned home to Minsk earlier than expected. He disappeared for many days, and that added to speculation that something might be seriously wrong with him. He's subsequently come out in the last, I want to say, 24 hours, and held a couple of he's had a couple of meetings filmed and things like that. He still does not look good. There's video of him in a meeting with some of his military leadership, and he's puffy and he's wearing makeup. The bandage is still on his hand. So there's something up with Alexander Lukashenko. We won't know, I think, unless it gets to critical mass, because information flow coming out of Minsk is it's strictly controlled by the state.
Right. Is Belarus being used as a staging area for attacks
now,
against
as
Ukraine?
to what Belarus, right? As to what Belarus is being used, it's been used as a staging area. At the beginning of the war, armored columns came out from Belarus. They were Russian units, but they came through Belarus. The airfields are used occasionally to launch planes. That attack Ukraine. So it's been a staging area. There's been pressure put on Lukashenko to actually provide Belarusian soldiers to the war effort. But the problem that Lukashenko has is that those are the same forces that keep his population down. And there is a very strong but pretty subdued by force opposition movement within Belarus, and so he can't send Belarusian troops themselves, but he has let Russians come through. Now, in addition to that, with the mass mobilization within Russia, they have a serious problem with training grounds, and so they're using some Belarusian army posts as training centers for these conscripts. They're just pulling out of Siberia. So Belarus is very much involved in the war, although not directly. And, that means that if Lukashenko actually is taken out of the equation, it will be damaging for Putin. It will be damaging for Russia's war effort. And also it will potentially, because there is no heir apparent, Lukashenko is grooming his son, but his son is not ready yet. He's too young and inexperienced. So there will be a power vacuum within Belarus. And as I say, there is a strong opposition movement, although much of it in exile or much of it forcibly subdued. If Lukashenko is suddenly out of the equation, you might find Belarus flipping from being pro-Russian, or at least a Russian client state, to a more Ukrainian favorable country.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I believe it was 2 years ago, or maybe it was 3 years ago. There were those huge protests. I mean, literally,
protests.
500,000, 1 million people in the streets of Minsk, and they put up with them for 3 or 4 days with fire hoses and dogs, and then they started shooting into the crowds. And after they'd killed a whole bunch of people, the protests kind of died down, and the whole story went away. And I was wondering where that went.
That's right. Well, it was forcibly put down. It wasn't just the shooting into the crowds. They were rounding up people, taking them into police stations, and brutally torturing them. And people would come out of those police stations with these bruises all over their body. And that, I think, also contributed to a lot of people saying, they're not. I'm not going to submit myself to that. So, and also in addition to that, the opposition was jailed. The wife of the primary opponent to Lukashenko in a sham election, although he showed up in good faith, his wife has now taken over the opposition position, but she's in exile. She's not in Belarus. Her husband is in jail. It's an ugly situation in Belarus, but the bigger picture with what is happening there is if Lukashenko suddenly disappears, and if there is unless Russia finds a puppet to replace him with, there's a very good chance that a free Ukrainian movement will come into power in Minsk, and that will change the power dynamic in the war. So it's a very serious situation.
There you go. Phil Ittner, check out his video blog over at YouTube too. Hang on just a second,
is
Phil.
the Thom Hartmann Program.
Phil, thanks so much for dropping by. It's always great talking with you.
Good talking to you, Tom.
Thank you. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. Stay tuned. And welcome back. It's not just the 14th Amendment. There are a number of things that Democrats could be doing to stop the blackmail attempts. The latest, or extortion, I guess it would be the right word, by the Republicans to try to force Joe Biden into essentially creating a Great Depression. here in the United States. I mean, this is what the Republicans are trying to do. They're trying to force the Democrats into some kind of a deal that will cripple the economy, because they know that a crippled economy going into 2024 will be a good thing for Republicans. And if Democrats refuse to go along with that, then, you know, the ultimate hand grenade goes off, or the ultimate nuclear bomb, really, which is default. So there's a number of parts of the Constitution and of our federal law that Democrats, or specifically President Biden, could be using. The first and the most famous, the one that everybody is talking about, the one that I wrote about 3 or 4 weeks ago at HartmannReport.com, in a fairly detailed article going all the way back to 1917, the whole history of the Second Liberty Bond Act, and, you know, where the debt ceiling came from, is the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment says that the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. And the debt ceiling is clearly a questioning of the public debt of the United States. Now we're hearing from Democratic politicians and from the Biden administration, well, you know, yes, but we'd really rather do that after the debt ceiling has been lifted and take it, because it's going to have to go through the courts and it's going to end up before the Supreme Court, and God only knows what's going to happen, and some judge could just decide to say, no, you can't pay bills, Janet Yellen, you cannot do it. And then you've got a constitutional crisis if President Biden says to Janet Yellen, yeah, go ahead and pay the bills anyway. I mean, this is the desire of Republicans to exploit what's essentially a loophole. You know, a law from 1917 that is clearly, in my opinion, the opinion of many constitutional scholars, and I'm not saying that I'm one, but, you know, many people who actually are constitutional scholars, patently unconstitutional. But, you know, the way that our system is set up right now, the final say on what is and what isn't constitutional goes to the Supreme Court. And, you know, it's not with the president. So there's the 14th Amendment. There's also the Take Care Clause, Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution. Now, Article 2 is the part of the Constitution that deals with the executive branch, the president. And the Take Care Clause says that the president must, not may, not has the option, not, you know, hey, you can think about it, must take care that the laws of the United States are followed, that the United States pays its bills, that the United States does the things that it's obligated to do, that the commitments that we make are kept. And I think the Take Care Clause is as much as, you know, has as much force here, frankly, as the 14th Amendment. There's also a doctrine, a court doctrine called the absurd result doctrine, which is that, you know, a law may be written in a way that is weird or ambiguous or whatever, but if the interpretation of that law produces a quote, absurd result, then, you know, you can't really interpret the law that way. That's the another one. And I think that, frankly, all of those should be brought to bear. I'd like to see a major lawsuit be brought. And in fact, there is one right now. There's Democrats in Congress who are suing around this. Anyhow, we'll be right back. Stay tuned. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Welcome back. 23 minutes past the hour. We were just talking with Phil Ittner about, you know, the situation in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia and all that sort of thing. There's just an extraordinary story. It's over at Daily Kos right now. The headline is Ukraine Update, Interview with Russian POW Tells Story of Harrowing Escape. And what it is, you know, they're down to trench warfare now. And the Russians have just been bringing these new conscripts in and throwing them in these trenches with, you know, guns and helmets, and that's pretty much it, and saying, okay, shoot it out. And this one new conscript, young man who was, you know, dragged into this fight. Well, let me back up a little bit. And the way that the Ukrainians have been taking them out is, rather than sending soldiers in, they're sending drones in. And these drones have the ability to carry things and drop them. And so what they've been doing is they've been carrying hand grenades in, positioning them right over the the trench full of Russian soldiers and dropping the grenades. So when this young conscript shows up, and there's video of this, you can see the whole video of this whole thing over at Daily Kos. When the conscript, this particular new conscript showed up, he had to climb over bodies of, in some cases, bodies that have been there for weeks, of his fellow Russian soldiers. So a Ukrainian drone comes along, and first of all, this is unknown to this Russian soldier, but it is known to everybody else. The Ukrainians have a policy with these drones: don't drop hand grenades or grenades. Don't drop them on soldiers who are not shooting at the drones or who are unarmed. Leave them alone. Even though they're soldiers for the other side, don't kill them. Which is pretty amazing when you think about it, as a very, very high-level rule of war. So in the video, the first Ukraine sends a drone into this trench, and it drops papers that have instructions on how to surrender. And the soldier is one of three. There's these three soldiers. One of the three soldiers has been killed by a grenade that was dropped on him because he was shooting at the drone. So the drone just dropped a grenade on him, and he was turned into a hamburger. The second soldier was wounded by the shrapnel from that, and he thinks the drone is going to kill him. Now, the Russian soldiers have been told that if you're captured by the Ukrainians, they're going to torture you and then kill you. That's their standard operate, which is obviously not the case at all. So this guy, so his buddy, commits suicide. Puts a gun to his own head, or actually throws himself on a hand grenade and blows himself up. So now this one guy is left all by himself, and he signals to the drone, "Are you going to kill me?" He uses this, throat-slitting motion, and the drone shakes its head. It waves itself back and forth as a no, I'm not going to kill you. And then, the drone basically is communicating with this guy by flashing lights, and the guy is following this drone across the battlefield. And as he's going, the Russian soldiers are trying to shoot their own soldier as this kid is trying to surrender. And he looks like he's 16 years old. I mean, he's probably 18 or 19, but he's just a kid. And finally, he makes it to Ukrainian territory where he's safe, and the Ukrainians welcome him. Hey, come on in. We'll take care of you. We'll give you some food. Everything's good. It's just an amazing story. You got to check it out. It's like I said, it's over at Daily Kos. I believe it was written by Marcos himself. It's titled Ukraine Update, Interview with Russian POW Tells Story of Harrowing Escape. And it just tells you a whole awful lot about, the terrorists versus the people who are with some nobility trying to defend their homeland.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Is the Supreme Court going to make gerrymandering worse? They just announced a new case. I'll tell you about that on the other side of this break, and then I'll pick up your calls. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Book Club. Today we're reading from Point to Point Navigation, a memoir by Gore Vidal. This is from the last two chapters, and we're reading from page 258. In 1961, a new president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, was inaugurated at the age of 43. With him, a new generation had taken the crown from the older generation as represented by General Eisenhower. There was triumphant talk of a new frontier, presumably to be crossed by all of us into a bright new land where the only shadow that marred the prospect was that of the hideous, murderous specter of international communism centered upon the Soviet Union, against whom JFK had sworn to bear any burden to ensure the ultimate victory of freedom, liberty, and so on. But early on, starting in 1959, under the general direction of then Vice President Richard Nixon, who had many interesting Cuban mob connections. Yes, Bibi Rebozo, his mysterious friend, was also linked not only to mobsters, but to the Cuban dictator Batista, who had been overthrown by Fidel Castro, to the annoyance of the mob, an annoyance that turned to fury when Castro shut down, if only briefly, the mafia-run Havana casinos. Elements of the CIA were soon attempting to murder Castro, who, like all Nixon enemies, was, if not yet a communist, worst a communist dupe. The presidential election of 1960 was a close one, fought by Nixon and John Kennedy, an attractive Massachusetts senator whose father had, ironically, dealings with many mobsters during the pre-World War II period, as well as at the time of the prohibition of alcohol. The late film producer Ray Stark told me how during the short presidency of JFK, Joe Kennedy and Frank Costello, the retired New York mob overlord, would often have dinner at Kennedy's Central Park South apartment and rehash old crimes, often in the country of a retired teamster who gave great massages. Joe's mob connections were useful to Jack in the 1960 election and could easily have saved JFK's life in 1963 had Bobby Kennedy, in the interest of building himself up in the public eyes, not started arresting important mobsters, particularly in the so-called Appalachian Mob Conference, bust, where they had all come together to confer about the secession of the leadership of the New York mob. I've long since forgotten how I first heard of the plot to kill JFK, while I had no idea at all of the Kennedy brothers' plot to kill Castro on December 1st, 1963, until I read a recent book by Lamar Waldron and Thom Hartmann called Ultimate Sacrifice. It was assumed that the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62 had sufficiently alarmed JFK and Castro's mentor Khrushchev so that they jointly backed down, putting an end, so everyone thought, to such dangerous adventures. JFK had pledged not to invade Cuba if Castro would allow inspections of any island. Since Castro did not cooperate, JFK then regarded his pledge as inoperative. In the spring of 1963, according to Ultimate Sacrifice, more a literal than an ironic title, John and Robert Kennedy started laying the groundwork for a coup against Fidel Castro that would eventually be set for what they called C-Day, December 1st, 1963. Bobby, like Nixon before him, was in charge of first engage mob hitmen to assassinate Castro and then replace Castro with a provisional government that would implore the United States to come to its aid and restore order. Ours is a society riddled with plots of every kind, from, let's say, one to bribe certain members of Congress to cheat Indians off of their casino money, to the financing, often secretly, of numerous presidential elections, while simultaneously great companies like Enron cheat customers, stockholders, and employees. Yet everyone who draws attention to all of this corruption is quickly denounced as a conspiracy theorist who means to undo the great fiction that anything truly wicked, at least in the murder line, must be the work of a solitary lone nut who is simply evil. Hence the setting up of Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone crazed killer of JFK, despite his own brief but presumably accurate statement after his Dallas arrest, "I'm the patsy." Then, as planned, his being gunned down by Jack Ruby, a fellow CIA asset. Oswald as lone killer for no reason at all, and addled Ruby, a one-time Chicago mobster who claimed to be deeply worried about the stress all this must be causing the widow Kennedy. And he goes on in chapter 55. Ultimate Sacrifice describes how the Kennedy C-Day plan was penetrated by three mafia godfathers, Carlos Marcello, New Orleans, Santo Traficante, Tampa, Florida, and Johnny Roselli out of Chicago. All three were being vigorously pursued by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, along with a dozen of their associates, of whom 6 were also working on the Castro murder case. The crime bosses then used parts of the C-Plan, a.k.a. AM World, to arrange JFK's assassination in a way that would prevent a thorough government investigation in order to protect the coup plan, its participants, as well as, naturally, national security by invoking the secrecy surrounding the C-Plan. The mob bosses targeted JFK twice before Dallas, once in Chicago on November 2nd, JFK called off his motorcade, and then in Tampa on November 18th. He survived unscathed. Ultimate Sacrifice reveals and details why Robert Kennedy later told several close associates the name of the godfather, Carlos Marcello, who had ordered his brother killed. But he couldn't do anything about it for fear the Soviets might go to war. Ironic and tragic action. I recalled when over the years I'd asked why what happened at Dallas happened, I'd answer, because Bobby had broken a truce made with the mob by Joe Kennedy in 1960. The book, Point-to-Point Navigation by Gore Vidal.
Hey, if you like the rants that I open the show with every day, they're typically published over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. Welcome back. So the Supreme Court just announced they're taking a new case, which might be, shall we say, problematic. It's Alexander versus South Carolina Conference at the NAACP. And here's the essence of the case. Is it legal for a Republican legislature to gerrymander a state in a way that is clearly based on race, even though they're claiming it's merely based on politics? And, what makes this possible, as it were, this confluence, this overlap, is the very real fact that ever since the Republican Party in 1968 adopted Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, ever since the Republican Party became officially the party of white supremacy and white nationalism, ever since that happened, by and large, one of the easiest indicators of who's a Democrat and who's a Republican is race. Now, among white people, it's about 60-40. About 60% of white people are Republicans, about 40% are Democrats. But among black people, it's more like in the neighborhood of 90% are Democrats. And among Hispanics, I believe it's closer to white people, only at the reverse. It's around 60%. Don't quote me on that one. Double check that. But that's my recollection. But the point is, this specifically has to do with black people in the Carolinas, in South Carolina. And what happened was the South Carolina legislature created a gerrymander where they had intentionally kept nearly 80% of the black population of Charleston County out of the 1st Congressional District in order to strengthen a Republican candidate. It's basically, it's kind of the gerrymandering version of blockbusting or something like that. Well, actually, it's not blockbusting. It's just racial gerrymandering. So this is going before the Supreme Court, and the Republicans are saying, well, the court has said before that partisan gerrymanders are just fine. We just can't do racial gerrymanders. Well, we weren't trying to block those people from having representation because they're black. We're trying to block them from having representation because they typically vote as Democrats. And this is going to be an opportunity for the Supreme Court to further muddy the waters and further support gerrymandering, and which is something that is, I would argue, aggressively devastating democracy in the United States. All right, let's pick up your phone calls here. Bruce in Stony Brook, New York. Hey, Bruce, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I really love your show.
Thank you.
You are amazing. A gentleman talked a little bit about abortion before, and the religious component to this, and I have an issue with the fact, as you have often said, up until the Reagan era, there was no abortion polarity in regards to voting Republican, Democrat, and all of a sudden the Republicans were all in with both feet, and the born-again contingent of the Republican Party. Now, my question arises, I'm thinking, what caused all the horseshoe crabs to come together at the same time and meet? And what I mean by that is, I believe that the religious right, the leaders of the religious right are bought. I believe that a lot of money is being spread around with the pastors and this community, giving them a good life that they would not have with their 15, 20 parishioner congregations. And I would hope that some newspaper or other media would pick this up. I don't know what your thoughts are on the subject.
Bruce, there have been multiple, actually books written about this. What happened was, you're correct. In 1973, we had the we had the Roe v. Wade decision, which legalized abortion across the United States. And at that time, if you said right to life, you were talking about the anti-death penalty movement, which called itself the Right to Life movement. And by 77, 78, 79, the anti-abortion movement was rebranding itself as pro-life, or as the Right to Life movement, and stealing that from the anti-death penalty people. But the big event was Ronald Reagan being nominated for president in 1980 in that election, and with George Herbert Walker Bush as his vice president. George H.W. Bush then brought his son, George W. Bush, a recovering alcoholic and a born-again Christian, into, well, actually, he's never admitted that he's a recovering alcoholic. I think it's just fairly obvious. But in any case, brought him into the campaign as the liaison to the religious right. And Jerry Falwell at that time, you know, if you're old enough to remember the 80s, that was the decade of, you know, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker and Jerry Falwell and, you know, all these televangelists. It had really become a thing. Well, that really started like in 77, 78, 79. It started just before the 80s. And one of the big things that really boosted it was in 1975, if I'm remembering correctly. You'd have to look it up. Hal Lindsey published a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And, you know, laying out the fact that the rapture, or his assertion that the rapture is coming, and, you know, and rapture hysteria, and then the Left Behind series got printed, these novels, and this all kind of fed right into 1980. So George W. Bush became the liaison along with Jerry Falwell and Ralph Reed, and these guys created this so-called Christian coalition, and basically took over the Republican Party. And there was a debate, you know, we've got to have an issue. Religious people have to have an issue. What will the issue be? What is it that we can bring to the table? What can we campaign on? And there were some people who were saying it should be pornography. We should be going against pornography, and we should be going against dirty words in song lyrics. Tipper Gore later picked that up in the 90s. But you know, they decided, well, you know, that's not going to do so well. I don't know if they were doing polling or what. But like I said, there's been books that have the whole story in them. But what they ultimately decided would be their issue was abortion, and that then was the birthing. And by the way, Reagan had signed as governor of California the most liberal abortion law in America, allowing abortion in California before Roe v. Wade, before 1973. Yep. And George Herbert Walker Bush had been, I don't believe he was on the board of Planned Parenthood, but he was a big supporter of them, and I think his wife might have been on the board of one of the local ones. They were huge.
I was going to ask that. I thought that was the case. HW was on the board.
Yeah, well, fact check me, because I'm not certain, and you know, I don't want to say things without a caveat that I'm not absolutely certain of on this program. I want people to be able to take anything I say to the bank. But whether he was on the board or not, he was on the record, both George Herbert Walker Bush and Barbara Bush, as being huge supporters of Planned Parenthood. Not so much about abortion, but just Planned Parenthood in general, birth control in particular. So that all changed in 1980 with that election, and by 1981, you know, it was off to the races, and so that's how we got where we are. Bruce, I have to move along, but thank you for the call. It was a great topic. Jeff in Minneapolis. Hey, Jeff, what's on your mind today?
Hey, I think we've got a couple of policies that, in my mind, are at cross purposes. Imagine if January 6th were successful and Trump somehow remained in power illegally. Wouldn't we want our populace to be armed so that we could? Why not?
Because what that leads to is the situation like you see in Syria right now, where you've got a 10-year, 15-year-long civil war, and cities are destroyed, and tens of thousands of people are slaughtered. I think it's much better, even if our country is taken over by fascists, frankly. I think it's much better that we be in the streets, that we have nonviolent resistance, that we take our country back by means other than weaponry. That it has, you know, fighting civil wars has a really, really bad track record. So.
Yeah, it does, but I just can't imagine submitting myself to rule that is unjust.
No, you don't. You don't. But you don't go out and shoot at the politicians and the police and whatnot. You work. I mean, there's 1,000 ways to work against an oppressive regime, and that's what we would have to do. Jeff, thanks for the call. Eric in Fountain Valley, California. Hey, Eric, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I wanted to discuss the debt ceiling with regard to some of these solutions that we talk about. Number one, is the discharge petition,
right,
which has now been opened in the House, and 210 Democrats have signed on to it. They need 5 Republicans to cross over.
That's right.
To reach 218, and once the 218 sign it, goes up for a vote, and presumably the 218 people vote for it, and it becomes a clean debt ceiling pass. So that's number one. Even though
let me just toss a caveat in here, Eric, and that is that, you know, I believe it was Marjorie Taylor Greene. It might have been one of the other members of the Sedition Caucus, but one of them came out yesterday or the day before and said that any Republican who signs that discharge petition, she will go into their district and campaign against them in the upcoming primaries. So they've got, you know, there's 18 Republican members of the House of Representatives right now who were elected in districts that went heavily for Joe Biden in the last election, and they're all at risk. So, you know, they're, on the one hand, they're afraid of the Democratic voters in their districts. On the other hand, they're afraid of, you know, the Sedition Caucus coming in and going after them.
Yeah, correct. So it may be a long shot, but that's one thing. With the 14th Amendment, there was an article in the LA Times, and it may not be the panacea that we think it is. In other words, their scenario was that Joe Biden orders Janet Yellen to continue paying the bills under the 14th Amendment. The Republicans immediately sue on an emergency basis, and the Supreme Court takes it up, or any court takes it up, actually, and orders the Treasury to stop doing that. And then we could have, like you said, a constitutional crisis where you have the Congress on one side, the president on the other side, and the Supreme Court, you know, kind of intervening there.
Yeah. No, I understand that, and I would, were I counseling the president, and obviously I'm not, but you know, were I counseling President Biden, I would say, you know, keep paying the bills regardless of what the court says. There's no shortage of precedents. Well, actually, there's only a few. You know, Andrew Jackson, as president, ignored the Supreme Court twice. He ignored them with regard to the Trail of Tears, as did Benjamin Harrison after him. I believe it was Harrison. And he ignored the Supreme Court with regard to the Second Bank of America. And then Abraham Lincoln came along, and he ignored the Supreme Court on the Dred Scott decision. He just said, yeah, it's a sad thing for Mr. Scott, but I'm not going to say that black people in the North can, that any white person can walk up and say, you're now my property. He refused to enforce a Supreme Court decision. Joe Biden could do the same thing.
Yes. Well, suffice it to say, it would take several people to have a very stiff backbone, and it would be a constitutional mess.
Yep. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And that's why the Democrats are saying that they want to get the debt ceiling raised and then deal with it through the courts and try to get that law taken down. But, I'm not real optimistic that the Republicans are going to play nice or play reasonable. Although we'll see. I mean, this discharge petition is a long shot, but it might work out. It just may work out. Eric, thank you for the call. You're spot on. We'll be back. It's 47 minutes past the hour, picking up your phone calls here on the Thom Hartmann program, helping you win the water cooler wars. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Boy, we're learning more and more about this guy who leaked all the top secret information, that he's just a right-wing Republican whack job. Phew. Welcome back. Bob in Farnham, Virginia. Hey, Bob, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Greetings from Virginia.
Thank you.
I kind of spoiled my morning coffee this morning when I turned on CNN and I saw the Queen of the Neanderthals, Marjorie, there with a press conference announcing how she's going to go to the Senate, House floor and call for articles of impeachment against Mayorkas, Christopher Wray, and the president and one other person.
Yeah.
So I thought that might be her idea for
it's going to raise her another $500,000 in the fundraising email that she sends out this afternoon. That's all it is.
But in relation to your mention a little while ago of their attempts to try and derail the economy, I think this presents to the public, and the way it'll be covered, this incredible diversionary scene going on in the other ring of the circus,
Yep.
and it'll take people's attention away.
Yep, I agree. Absolutely agree.
That was it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bob. Patrick in East Lansing, Michigan. Hey, Patrick, thanks for watching us on Facebook. What's up?
Oh, hi, Tom. I just wanted to recommend to you and to your listeners that you just Google Robert Hockett and Forbes and the debt ceiling, because he has helped us understand what every constitutional scholar has been saying, that the federal budget is its own debt ceiling, that this is a statutory question. We don't go straight to the 14th Amendment. We go to Article 1 and 2, which are the spending clause and the budgetary roles for Congress.
And the take care clause.
Passed the take care clause, which says that you take care to enforce laws. Well, what's the law? The law is simple. 1974 Budget Act, it's still in effect. And it says when Congress passes a budget, that's the debt ceiling. And how do you fund it? Then you go pay the bills. So pay the bills. How do you pay the bills? Well, you get revenue from taxes, and you get to continue to take the bonds on your portfolio. But if the bonds are too low in value and they come due and you owe more than you have in revenue, you issue more bonds.
Yep.
And the Treasury has no choice. What everyone is saying, they're all illegal. The presentment clause, no one mentions that. It prevents a line item veto. The impoundment cases say you can't shut the government down and pay bondholders and not pay employees. Boucher v. Sinar, U.S. Supreme Court, said that's unconstitutional. Congress has told the president to spend the money, and it's his duty to raise the revenue. So it's really, really, really simple what this means for all of us, which is we raise the debt ceiling, or if they don't do that and no deal, which is no deal is likely, we get to the June 1st date, there can be no default. And people know you're going to talk about Social Security, but people don't really understand, or should understand and maybe do and forgot, that the largest single market for bonds in this world, entire world, is the $25 trillion U.S. Treasury market. Not only is it the safest investment in the world, money floods in from all over the world to hold those assets.
Yep.
Those assets will be devalued, their value will plummet, and every other asset is marked to the value of the Treasury.
I know, we saw this in 2011. It took us 2 years to recover from it, Patrick. You're absolutely right.
Won't take the case. They won't take this case because it's a political question and there's no standing. But if they do, there are 7 or 8 votes to say you enforce the statutes. You never get to the 14th Amendment. So for Biden and Schumer to say we have to reach a deal is political malpractice that
Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. 52 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls. Ike in Charleston, South Carolina. Hey, Ike, what's up? Okay, I guess we're not going to be talking to Ike. Lawrence in Berkeley, California. Hey, Lawrence, what's on your mind today? Lawrence? Geez, I hope we're not having phone problems again. Let me put Lawrence on hold, and let's try Don in Los Angeles. Hey, Don, can you hear me?
Oh, hey, Tom. Yeah. Hey, listen, I'm not sure if this is off topic or whatever for you, but I've been trying to figure out the status of the independent state legislature movement that, the Republicans are trying to promote so that they can ignore the will of the people. Do you think it could throw the next election into chaos in the Electoral College? Is it still a thing out there?
Yeah, it could. I wrote about this. If you click on any of my op-eds over at HartmannReport.com and then scroll down to the very bottom, it'll show you the top hits, the other articles that I've written that have the top hits. And the second most read of mine articles is about how the Supreme Court could rule in the context of the independent state legislature theory in a way that would, basically hand the next election to the GOP. And it would do it by saying that it doesn't matter how people vote in the individual states. What matters under the Constitution, and there's actually a constitutional argument to be made here, The Constitution essentially says that each state gets to decide how their electoral votes are going to be determined. And, if the legislature, and it's not even the governor of the state who has that decision-making power, it is the legislature of the state, the combined House and Senate, where there's one state, I believe, Nebraska, I think, is unicameral, but everybody else is bicameral. And so that legislature can come up with the determination of where that state's electoral college votes are going to go. And I mean, this was the argument. A part of this was the argument that John Eastman was making. And I think that there's a very real possibility that the Supreme Court will go along with it because of the way the Constitution is written.
Well, what case is before them? The North Carolina case was kind of
it's
just
Harper v. Moore.
Because it's what that again?
Harper v. Moore.
Still in play? It's still in play.
Oh yeah. They have not issued the decision on it. So really? I believe it's been argued before the court. I think that happened a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago. But fact check me on that. It might have just been the preliminary stuff necessary to hear the case. But that's the case that everybody is worried about. Don, thanks for the call. Sue in Whaleyville, Maryland. Hey, Sue, what's up?
Yep, that's it. How you doing, Tom?
Good
to talk to you. Listen, I have a friend of mine. I'm in a very, very red part of my state. But what I want to ask you is, my friend and I go back and forth with this. Are you surprised that no Republican, especially, that's serving in the GOP, with children, grandchildren, that not a single one of them has stepped out and said this is unconscionable, this gun violence, this insane cruelty? Like, I just cannot. I've seen people change over my lifetime. I just cannot believe that there's not a single one of them that's coming forward to say this is hideous. What are we doing?
The reason,
especially the ones like Mitt Romney and
Yeah, the reason that no Republican will take a position that we need to have some kind of reasonable gun control is because they're owned by the NRA. They're terrified of the NRA. And it's not just the NRA. I mean, the NRA is basically the front group for the guns manufacturers. And these days, you want to buy a semi-automatic weapon, you're talking thousands of dollars. These guns are extraordinarily profitable. This is a very, very wealthy industry. They own these people.
No, I really didn't want to go into the gun thing as much as I wanted to go into the idea that where's these people's conscience about any of this stuff?
Well, I think they abandoned their conscience when they declared that they were Republicans.
It's so hard to believe that no one's stepping forward and saying.
Well, it tells you everything you need to know about the GOP. Sue, I got to run, but thank you for the call. Wow. Okay, Alex Lawson's going to drop by at the top of the next hour and tell us all about Social Security and the debt ceiling. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at ThomHartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the HartmannReport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at ThomHartmann.com. So check them all out at ThomHartmann.com and HartmannReport.com.
We say fight back!
landscapes across the globe for thousands of years. From Circe to Hermione, from Morgan Le Fay to Marie Laveau, the witch has long existed in the tales we tell about ladies with strange powers who can harm or heal. And although people of all genders have been considered witches, it's a word that is now usually associated with women. Throughout most of history, she has someone to fear, an uncanny other who threatens our safety or manipulates reality for her own mercurial purposes. She's a pariah, a persona non grata, a boogie woman to defeat and discard. Although she's often been deemed a destructive entity, in actuality, a witchy woman has historically been far more susceptible to attack than an inflictor of violence herself. As with other terrifying outsiders, she occupies a paradoxical role in cultural consciousness as both vicious aggressor and vulnerable prey. Over the past 150 years or so, however, the witch has done another magic trick by turning from a fright into a figure of inspiration. She is now as likely to be the heroine of your favorite TV show as she is its villain. She might show up in the form of your Wiccan co-worker, or the beloved musician who gives off a sorceress vibe in videos or on stage. There's also a chance that she is you, and that witch is an identity you've taken upon yourself for any number of reasons, heartfelt or flippant, public or private. Today, more women than ever are choosing the way of the witch, whether literally or symbolically. They're floating down catwalks and sidewalks in gauzy black clothing and adorning themselves with Pinterest-worthy pentagrams and crystals. They're filling up movie theaters to watch witchy films and gathering in back rooms and backyards to do rituals, consult tarot cards, and set life-altering intentions. They're marching in the streets with Hex the Patriarchy placards and casting spells each month to try to constrain the commander-in-chief. Year after year, articles keep proclaiming it's the season of the witch, as journalists try to wrap their heads around the mushrooming witch trend. And all of this begs the question, why? Why do witches matter? Why are they seemingly everywhere right now? What exactly are they? And why the hell won't they go away? I get asked such things over and over, and you would think that after a lifetime of studying and writing about witches, as well as hosting a witch-themed podcast and being a practitioner of witchcraft myself, my answers would be succinct. In fact, I find that the more I work with the witch, the more complex she becomes. Hers is a slippery spirit. Try to pin her down and she'll only recede further into the dark, deep wood. I do know this for sure, though. Show me your witches, and I'll show you your feelings about women. The fact that the resurgence of feminism and the popularity of the witch are ascending at the same time is no coincidence. The two are reflections of each other. That said, this current witch wave is nothing new. I was a teen in the 1990s, the decade that brought us such pop culture as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Charmed, and The Craft. Not to mention Riot Girls and third-wave feminists who taught me that female power could come in a variety of colors and sexualities. I learned that women could lead a revolution while wearing lipstick and combat boots, and sometimes even a cloak. But my own witchly awakening came at an even earlier age. Morganville, New Jersey, where I was raised, was a solidly suburban town, but it retained enough natural land features back then to still feel a little bit scruffy in spots. We had a small patch of woods in our backyard that abutted a horse farm, and the two were separated by a wisp of running water that we could cross via a plank of wood. When we were little, my older sister Emily and I would sometimes venture to the other side where we could feed the horses, an act that still scares me to this day, and pick fistfuls of clover. But the majority of our time was spent on our side of the stream, threading ourselves through the thicket of trees that served as our personal forest. In one corner of the yard, a giant puddle would form whenever it rained, surrounded by a border of ferns. We called this spot our magical place. That it would vanish and then reappear only added to its mystery. It was a portal to the unknown. These woods are where I first remember doing magic, entering that state of deep play where imaginative action becomes reality. I would spend hours out there creating rituals with rocks and sticks, drawing secret symbols in the dirt, losing all track of time. It was a space that felt holy and wild, yet still strangely safe. As we age, we're supposed to stop filling our heads with such nonsense. Unicorns are to be traded in for Barbie dolls, though both are mythical creatures to be sure. We lose our tooth fairies, walk away from our wizards. Dragons get slain on the altar of our youth. Most kids grow out of their magic phase. I grew further into mine. My grandma Trudy was a librarian at the West Long Branch Library, which meant I got to spend many a long afternoon lurking between the 001.9 and 135 Dewey Decimal sections, reading about Bigfoot and dream interpretation in Nostradamus. Waking the Witch by Pam Grossman.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
A lot of news. Welcome back to the third hour of our program, by the way. A lot of news around Social Security, Medicare, Medicare for all kinds of cool stuff going on, and some kind of scary stuff as well. Alex Lawson is on the line with us, the executive director of SocialSecurityWorks.org or StrengthenSocialSecurity.org. His Twitter handle, ALaw202 or SSWorks. And Alex, welcome back to the program. Are there any other websites you want to mention here as part of your introduction?
I think that was enough, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Great. It's good work you're doing. It's really good work you're doing. I'm constantly sending people to your website. So, number one, we've got the Republican Party working as hard as they can, at least the Republicans in the House of Representatives, to try to crash our economy via this device of the debt ceiling. And they have done this before. We've actually had government shutdowns. We've never had a default, but we've had government shutdowns. What has been the consequence for Social Security in the past, and what might we expect this time as we get closer and closer to the possibility of at least a freeze before a default?
Yeah, it's really uncharted territory. So a government shutdown and defaulting on our obligations are like orders of magnitude different. If the U.S. were to ever not pay one of its bills, which is what's being talked about. It's not about spending, it's about paying bills that we've already spent or that we owe our own people, like Social Security. Social Security, the U.S. people are the largest debt holder of U.S. Treasury bonds. Before any of the banks or other countries or anything, Americans own U.S. Treasury bonds. And that's because the U.S. government pays its bills and always has more than enough money to pay its bills. But the Republicans in the House are using this absolutely asinine construction of the debt ceiling, which is a button that was built by legislation. And if you don't push it, the world economy blows up. And you're like, well, we should get rid of the button, right? Obviously. But they're threatening default. And what the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary Yellen says is Social Security checks will not get sent out because the U.S. can't pick and choose which debts it pays. So if it's not allowed by the Republicans to pay its obligations, people who rely on their Social Security checks in the latter part of June, July, they might not get their checks, Tom. And that's not something that people can live without in many cases. And then what the Republicans are holding our Social Security, our veterans benefits, the whole world economy hostage to do are devastating cuts to Social Security. 22% cut to Social Security administration. The administration is stretched way too thin as it is, as you and your listeners know. If you try to get an appointment with Social Security right now, it's too hard now. We need to be increasing spending. We need to be opening offices. 10,000 baby boomers are retiring each month, and the Republicans propose to cut the administration's budget, the Social Security Administration's budget, by almost a quarter. I mean, you tell me, Tom, do you think that they could actually even continue to operate in any way, shape, or form?
Well, I think what we're seeing here, Alex, is that they would love to have the Social Security Administration. I mean, they did this with the IRS. They did this with the EPA. Lay off as many people as you can. The EPA doesn't directly interface with consumers, but the IRS does. You lay off as many people as you can, and then when people try to reach out to those agencies, they have a very, very bad experience. They're on hold for hours. It takes days to get an answer. In some cases, weeks or months to get an answer to even simple questions. And at that point, they're like, screw this. Yes, privatize Social Security. Give it all to Jamie Dimon and let him run it out of JP Morgan. It'll work better that way. I mean, that's what the Republicans are trying to do, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's either destroy it along with the world economy, right, through the front door, or cut all of its funding through these death by 1,000 cuts. Although a 22% cut is just one killing blow, because nothing could survive losing, 22 cents out of every dollar that's just used right now to keep all the offices going and everybody working. I mean, it's not realistic. So the annoying thing to me, Tom, is that we have to treat these guys, these Republicans, as serious, right? I mean, in any logical world, they'd be laughed out of the room. We'd be like, push the button and then dismantle the button and get these people who were willing to crash the world economy so that they could starve seniors and people with disabilities, get rid of them. But we do know that there's these huge propaganda channels that the right wing can use to interface directly with their people and spin them an entirely separate story about what's going on, making them the heroes, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the corporate media who, they actually hate the idea of the debt ceiling of default, because it's one of the few times where the rich would actually suffer as well. Not as much as poorer people, obviously, but bondholders would get hit with the default. So it is that rare alignment where you might see Jamie Dimon even saying, "Hey, don't breach
There is a
the
caveat
debt ceiling."
to that. There is a caveat to that, and that is that some of the largest fortunes in America were made during the Great Depression. Whenever, and if you look at the major recessions that we have had over the years, during every one of them, the two that are most conspicuous, that are easily fact-checked, are the Bush crash of 2007, 2008, and the COVID crash of 2020. During those collapses of the stock market, the billionaires in America, just specifically the billionaire class, increase their wealth more rapidly than at any other time because they're buying opportunities. The stock market drops 30%. If you've got piles and piles of cash in your money bin, you just go in and buy up stocks. And as soon as the market recovers, you're just insanely richer than you were before. So,
absolutely, Tom.
There is a perverse incentive here.
That's completely correct. But I think that they don't want to breach the debt ceiling because default would mean a disaster.
I think the CEOs don't want to breach the debt ceiling. I think that the billionaires who are making their living as stock speculators and whatnot are giddy about it.
Well, they're giddy about recession. They like it when working people lose their jobs. Yeah. That's what they want. They root every day for working people to lose their job. Yeah. And if they can nudge the U.S. into recession, which again, this, Tom, that's what this is all about. The Republicans don't care about anything other than hurting the economy so that they can win the presidency next year, right?
That's
they
correct.
did the exact same thing to Obama, and it worked. It didn't work. They did not beat Obama, but they were able to negotiate these cuts in and wreck the economy. I mean, imagine where the economy would have been if there weren't the sequester, right? These made up words that just meant they were robbing the people. Public employees aren't actually an engine, a driver of our economy. And they're like, yeah, just pay them less, right? I mean, imagine how much harm they did the last age of austerity. And that's what we cannot allow to happen this time. Because you're right. The billionaires root for recession every morning with their tea and crumpets. I don't know what they eat. It's probably not tea and crumpets anymore. But they do eat what they feast on is wage earners losing their jobs.
Yeah,
right?
they eat the poor, metaphorically.
That's exactly right.
So, all right, so there's that, but that's kind of the bad news side of this thing. With the last 2 minutes or so we have here, I'd like to talk about the good news side of this thing. Medicare for All has been revived in this congressional session. Obviously, it's not going to pass as long as Republicans control the House, but you have to do this day by day or year by year. You have to, to build consensus around it. And this time, there's a lot of sponsors on this legislation that used to just be, John Conyers in his holding hearings in his little, literally a closet in the basement of the Capitol building.
Yeah, it's, so I also, really importantly, there's this understanding within this huge community of Americans who are like, we need guaranteed health care for everyone. That also means we cannot allow the insurers to destroy Medicare before we improve it and expand it. With
Medicare Advantage. Yep.
Exactly. And so that fight is very real right now. And I would see the introduction of Medicare for All as this is the goal long term, but also a really important, a battle right now in this fight with insurers who just crossed 50%. So 50% of Medicare eligible seniors, people in this country, now receive their care from private insurers through this so-called Medicare Advantage, which, as you know, Tom, has nothing to do with Medicare.
No, it's a scam.
It's a scam. And we're seeing some momentum back. It's really hopeful right now that we're going to see, some momentum. And basically, there's been an understanding that Medicare Advantage isn't just one thing. We know that the whole setup was a scam by Republicans, but everyone now can see that there are plans in there that are killing people. They wrongfully delay and deny care at such an insane level that you cannot put it any other way than they are making money off of killing people. And there's an awareness that at least that we have to eliminate. And then what we want to do is make sure that, they can't even, right now we overpay them and they underdeliver. We don't want to do either of those, right? And the solution is to make sure that traditional Medicare, that we add vision, hearing, dental, long-term care, and out-of-pocket cap, and expand it to everyone in this country. That's what Medicare for All is all about.
Yeah, and the champions for it, I know it's Bernie Sanders in the Senate and in the House.
Pramila Jayapal in the House.
Yep, and don't they have more than 100 sponsors this time around?
Yeah, and so Pramila Jayapal, Debbie Dingle. Sorry for cutting you off, Tom. I got excited. I love Medicare for All.
Good.
The introduction was there were so many people there you couldn't even list all the names. So this is core. This is in the mainstream of Democratic policies. Medicare for All is just, it is understood as the guiding light that we're pushing towards. Right. So you had all the senators back on. We need to continue to make gains in the Senate. And then in the House, you saw incredible numbers. And I will say also, this was the first time in a bunch of years that we've had them done at the same time.
There you go. So reach out to your politicians and say Medicare for All. Alex Lawson, Social Security Works. Alex, hang on just a second here.
This is the Thom Hartmann program.
Guy always steps on me. Alex, thanks so much for dropping by. Great talking with you.
Thanks, Tom.
SocialSecurityWorks.org. Check it out. We'll be back. And welcome back. Ryan in Kansas City, Missouri. Hey, Ryan, what's on your mind today?
First of all, I'm a millennial. Second of all, you're fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Then I wanted to ask you a question.
Okay.
You bet. I wanted to ask you a question, Tom. The conversation that we're having about this debt ceiling, the default, and then that $1 trillion coin that the Treasury Department could mint. How long do you think we could realistically continue to do that before things go south?
Well, define things go south.
Before the inflationary pressure does become too much from doing that.
There you go. This is, I encourage you to check out modern monetary theory. Now, I'm not totally in the bag with those folks, but I'm 90% of the way there. And the argument that they make is that we could wipe out the entire national debt, that the national debt is basically, because we own our own currency, we can simply print dollars to pay for the debt and pay it off. We wouldn't want to do that because the worst depression that the United States ever had was in the 1830s when Andrew Jackson paid off the entire debt of the United States. And the result of that was that nobody could invest in treasuries because we didn't have to sell treasuries to raise money. And when nobody can invest in treasuries, there is no safe instrument for savings, particularly for large institutions. And the result of that was, bank failures all across the country because, who do you trust, right? So number one, you want to keep a national debt because the bonds are a stabilizing force on the economy. But if you were to pay off the entire national debt of the United States, $30 trillion more or less, that would not be enough to produce inflationary pressure. That the inflationary pressure we're experiencing right now is much, much larger than the national debt. Where it
sounds then like it could be sustained for a period of time.
It could be sustained arguably for forever. Japan, for example, which right now has about a 2% inflation rate, the national debt of Japan is more than 200% of GDP. We're only at about 105%, 110% of GDP. And Japan has been there, by the way, for almost 3 decades.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
You're welcome. Good talking to you. Lawrence in Berkeley. Hey, Lawrence, what's on your mind today?
Hi, can you hear me this time?
I can.
Wonderful. Great. I wanted to say that there's an additional problem to citing the 14th Amendment or any other constitutional provision for, paying the debt ceiling. And that is that long before the Supreme Court rules on it, it's going to go to the House of Representatives. And it's very likely, and I think Biden knows this, that the House of Representatives will institute a budget which will kill the economy. They'll take all the money away from poor people.
But they can't do that without the Senate.
No, but they will go quite a distance towards it. And so that's why he's negotiating.
Yeah. No, I get it. It could get very messy. It also could get thrown to just some crackpot right-wing judge like Kaczmarek, and he could just put a freeze on our spending, on our, on Janet Yellen paying the bills, while it gets appealed, and that could be a mess too. Lawrence, thank you. Excellent point. Excellent point. I get it. I totally get it. 22 minutes past the hour. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans have been pushing legislation and ideas that would basically crash the economy. And a lot of people are kind of scratching their heads going, why would Republicans who basically are owned by billionaires and big corporations, why would they want to crash the economy? Doesn't that hurt billionaires and big corporations? In fact, no, it doesn't. Billionaires and big corporations actually get richer and more profitable during economic crashes. The largest fortunes in America were made during the Great Depression, or some of them. Joe Kennedy, J. Paul Getty, they made a fortune because it was a buying opportunity. Everything was cheap because everything had crashed, so they were buying up stock and buying houses. They had cash. Also, they have more negotiating power with unions, with workers, with their vendors. There's all kinds of benefits to billionaires and big corporations of having a crash. So don't think the Republicans won't do it. There's a whole article about it over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. "24 minutes past the hour. A couple of geeky sciences for you here that I think you're just going to love. This is fascinating stuff. Number one, the world's largest manufacturer of batteries for electric vehicles is based in China. It's a company called CATL. Excuse me. And they just announced at the Shanghai Auto Show that they are going to begin mass production this year, and we're halfway through the year, of a new battery for cars that has twice the energy density of current batteries. Now, what the heck is energy density? Think about your gasoline car. Your gasoline car has a gas tank. Let's say that gas tank holds 10 gallons of gas, and so 10 gallons at 30 miles per gallon will get you 300 miles, right? So you've got 300 miles worth of gas in a 10-gallon tank that's the size of a suitcase. Well, that same 300 miles of electricity in like my Ioniq 5, my Hyundai, is a battery that is the size of 4 suitcases. It's much larger than the gas tank because the energy density of the battery is smaller. It holds less energy, so you have to have more physical battery. Well, this battery is twice as dense. It's approaching gasoline. It's not quite there, but it's damn close. And they're saying that these batteries then could be used to power airplanes as well as cars. It's a semi-solid state design, by the way. All the batteries now are using gel or liquid. This is solid state, so it's safer, it's more stable. And this is the company, by the way, CATL. It stands for Contemporary Amperex Technology Company, that supplies batteries for BMW, General Motors, Tesla, and Volkswagen. They are saying that this year they're going to be rolling this battery out. Well, this battery, if it's the same size as the old batteries, I mean, right now my car, for example, has about a 250-mile range. My car would have a 500-mile range just swapping the battery out, same physical size. So pretty soon, in the next year or two, we're going to start seeing electric vehicles with 300, 400, 500, 600-mile ranges. I mean, right now the best range that's out there is 500 miles. It's a $100,000 car. More and more of your electric vehicles have 300-mile ranges. That's become fairly normal, which is about what you have with a normal gasoline car. So this is a huge breakthrough. And it's not just in the lab. This is a huge breakthrough that is going into production in the next few months. Geeky Science number 2, our brains are shrinking, but it doesn't have to be this way. And I'll tell you all about that right after the break, and then I'll pick up your phone calls. Stay with us.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's the place where despair is not an option. I'll be right back.
Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery by Mark Charles and Soon-Chan Ra. This is from chapter 1. You cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. I, Mark, said this almost under my breath as I walked past a line of men dressed as Spanish sailors from the 1490s. I was in front of Union Station in Washington, D.C., near the massive statue of Christopher Columbus overlooking the United States Capitol. Every Columbus Day, there's an official ceremony in this plaza honoring Columbus as the discoverer of America. I had stumbled upon this ceremony by accident the year prior. There were a few non-natives holding signs and protesting the ceremony, but nothing very disruptive. I went back the following year primarily out of curiosity. I wasn't intending to protest, nor did I want to make a scene. As I walked up behind the statue and approached the group of men dressed as Spanish sailors, the words just came out of my mouth. You cannot discover lands already inhabited. As I walked further down the line, I said it again, this time a little louder. You cannot discover lands already inhabited. As I continued walking, I came to the front of the line where a group of men dressed in suits were standing. I repeated myself, making sure they could hear me. You cannot discover lands already inhabited. Suck it up, was the reply I heard as I kept walking. By this time, I'd walked around the statue and reached the front where a small stage had been erected and chairs set up for people to watch the ceremony. It hadn't started yet, but more than half the audience was seated waiting for it to begin. So I stopped near the center, turned toward the crowd, and in a calm but loud voice I said to the people, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. That process is known as stealing, conquering, or colonizing. The fact that America calls what Columbus did discovery reveals the implicit racial bias of the country, that Native Americans are not fully human.
Quickly, one of the white men dressed in a suit walked over and interrupted me. "You are not welcome here," he said as he grabbed my arm and began walking me away. I attempted to explain the inappropriateness of both celebrating this holiday as well as hosting this ceremony, but instead of engaging in conversation, he threatened me with arrest and escorted me from the area. As I walked away from the gathering, I was amused at his words and the irony of their context. A white man participating in a public ceremony honoring Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of America, telling a native man he was not welcome in that space. How did a flawed assumption about the place of the indigenous population in U.S. society become normative? How are assumptions so deeply ingrained in the American psyche and imagination that dysfunctional and oppressive actions emerge? How did a dysfunctional idea and worldview form that allows for the displacement of native bodies? One of the explanations for the formation of this dysfunctional worldview is the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is a set of legal principles that governed the European colonizing powers, particularly during the administration of indigenous land, regarding the administration. It is the primary legal precedent that still controls native affairs and rights, and international law formulated in the 15th and 16th centuries. From a theological perspective, the legal and political role of the doctrine of discovery is rooted in a dysfunctional theological imagination that shaped the European colonial settler worldview. The doctrine emerged from a series of 15th century papal bulls, which are official decrees by the Pope that carry the full weight of his ecclesiastical office. On June 18, 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Dum Diversus, which initiated the first set of documents that would compose the doctrine of discovery. The official decree of the Pope granted permission to King Alfonso V of Portugal, quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever, held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his or their use and profit. End of quote from Pope Nicholas's papal bull of 1452. Dum Diversus would identify the Saracens, a common term for Muslims at the time, and pagans, essentially identifying any non-Christians as others, as those who could be targeted for, quote, perpetual slavery. The papal bull intentionally used language that identified those outside the European Christian world and enforced the Western theological imagination of non-Europeans as other. The Portuguese took these ecclesiastical statements to heart and perpetrated the slave trade from the African continent to the European and the American continents. As a Christian ruler, the King of Portugal would have power endowed from the church to take possession of the other as slave labor from the continent of Africa. The pagan African body was just another commodity to be taken for the pleasure and profit of the European Christian body, the one made most fully in the image of God. In the January of 1454, Pope Nicholas authored another bull. The book is Unsettling Truths by Charles and Ra. From international trade policy to immigration policy to housing, we've got all kinds of topics. The wars between Republicans and Democrats, the Republican efforts to induce fascism in the United States. A great selection of opinions will be found over at HartmannReport.com. Are you feeling exhausted by Donald Trump? So many Americans are. And not Donald Trump, not just Donald Trump. The entire GOP. We've got this war on trans people. We've got a war on queer people. We've got a war on people of color, a war on voting, young people concerned about climate change, and Republicans not only refusing to do anything about it, but like Marjorie Taylor Greene out there talking about how, oh, well, it's just normal variation, you know, it's nothing to worry about. Just keep on shoveling that coal. People cutting pills in half because they can't afford their medicine. Parents who don't have enough money to properly dress their kids for school, even though they're working full time. Seniors fearing that the Republican Party is going to finally succeed in killing off Social Security and Medicare. They're trying it again. You know, it's this whole, yes, we'll raise the debt ceiling as part of cut Social Security. It's nuts. I got a whole op-ed about it over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. Welcome back. So, brain shrinkage, really? This sounds like something out of a bad science fiction movie, but it's real. There's an indigenous tribe of people in Bolivia, down in South America, who they're hunter-gatherers. These are like people who are living the way that your and my ancestors lived 10, 20, 30,000 years ago. The average, they're called the Tsimane, Tsimane. And the Tsimane people walk an average of 17,000 steps a day. Now, you've heard walk 10,000 steps. I don't know how many steps I walk every day, but I walk about 2 miles every day. So, you know, whatever that works out to. But the average Tsimane walks 17,000 steps. And one of the things that they've found studying these people, and they have been studying them now for several years, is that they don't get dementia as they age. And they are not genetically unique. These are people who are genetically very similar to many of the people who are living in villages and towns in Bolivia who are experiencing dementia. So what makes the difference? Well, what they found is that between the ages of 40 and 94, among people in Europe and the United States, there's an average of 3% brain shrinkage per decade. Among the Tsimane, the brain shrinkage between the ages of 40 and 94 is 1.7% per decade. It's about half. So what accounts for this? Well, it turns out it's very simple. And this was just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The difference is that we eat more and we walk less. It's just that simple. And so if you want to avoid dementia, or if you want to stave it off, eat less and walk more. The average American consumes 24% more calories than we ourselves did just 6 decades ago. Back in the 1960s, we were consuming a quarter less of food than we eat right now in terms of calories. A lot of this can be attributed to junk food and fast food and all kinds of other terrible things. An analysis of data on 1,000 older women found the risk of developing dementia over 15 years was more than double in those who were the slowest in a timed test to get out of a chair, walk 10 feet, return, and sit back down again. Real simple test. Get out of that chair, walk to the other side of the room, walk back, sit down. How fast can you do that? The faster you could do it, or the people who couldn't do it fast, the people who did it slowly had double the risk of dementia over a 15-year period. They also found, this was another study, this was a study that was done with active older men and women, and they were found to have 1.4%, now this is active, people are walking more than a couple of miles a day, more than a mile a day, 1.4% more brain volume than the least active with a biological age 4 years younger than the number of their birthdays. The evidence that they found, number one, regular exercise can significantly reduce the risk of developing dementia by 30%. For Alzheimer's disease, the risk was reduced by 45%. And sedentary adults put on a program of moderate aerobic exercise after 6 months. Moderate aerobic exercise is like walk a mile or two every day, right? That's after 6 months, scored as though they were 10 to 20 years younger on cognitive tests than the same people who were the control group. That's breathtaking. So get out there and walk. Just take a walk every day. Just walk, 10, 12 blocks, that's all it takes. You don't have to, you don't have to do it fast. You don't have to do it hard, although the faster you go, the better. Because then it becomes aerobic exercise in addition to just regular exercise. All righty, let's pick up your phone calls here. Ike in Charleston, South Carolina. Hey, Ike, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hey, Tom, we got a little bit in common. And just out of curiosity, what's your age?
I'm 72.
72. Okay, you got me by 8 years, but I'm a former, I come from your hometown, Marietta.
Oh, I grew up in Lansing, Michigan. I lived in Marietta, Georgia for 6-7 years, something like that. And then we lived in Roswell for another 6 or 7. But
there you go, old stomping grounds for me.
Yep.
Okay, here's my question. The fellow that was busted for the for leaking the classified information,
right?
The National Guardsman.
Yeah, Jack.
How come that guy's? How come? Yeah, how come that guy's not in front of a? How come the military's not prosecuting him?
That's a good question. Maybe they're just figuring that the civilian courts have have it under control. But you're right. He's subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ. I mean, maybe that's coming next. I don't know.
Any military member that gets busted goes through their process first, and then if the civilian court, if it has anything to do with the civilian court, they get a crack at him later. But there's something wrong there. And one other thing, I've got a solution for your Supreme Court. Let's put 9 more justices on the bench, and then put all their names into a bingo hopper. And when the case comes up, you pick the names out of the hopper, and then that way they can't just pick the justices and bribe them.
Yeah, that's how it works with your appeals courts. You know, you have like 9 members of the court, but most of the cases are heard by a 3-judge panel, and they're more or less randomly selected. So, yeah, it's a good suggestion, Ike. I completely agree with you. And people who are talking about expanding the court have suggested that or variations on that. And this court it's got way more work than it can handle, and it should be expanded, frankly. Ike, thanks for the call. It's great to hear from you, and also from somebody who used to live in Marietta. Thank you. Marie in Atlanta. Hey, speaking of Georgia, hey, Marie, what's on your mind today?
Surprised to know that you used to be a Marietta fella.
Oh, yeah.
So I called because, all of these discussions about how Republicans want to change Social Security are worrisome in a few different ways. But here's what particularly galls me. They're talking about raising the age for eligibility to collect Social Security.
Right.
The problem with that is we have, in theory, protections against age discrimination in the law. But they are weak at best. Just try to bring an age discrimination claim. Most attorneys will tell you that it's like trying to get up a sheer rock face using your fingernails to climb up.
Right. It's been years since I've heard of any consequential cases like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, not that I'm saying that I think raising the age for eligibility is ever going to be a good idea. If there are not concurrent if there's not a concurrent strengthening of protections for older workers, it's just punishment for getting old.
You're right. That's
all it is.
That is a great contrast, Marie. And we just had the Social Security age raised by 2 years. It just went into effect a couple of years ago. I mean, it's now 67. It was 65 when I retired, or when I went on Social Security. This was a change that was made, by Reagan in '83, but they, wisely pushed it out 20, 30, 40, I guess 40 years before it took effect, so that the political fallout didn't hit Reagan all that hard. He also made Social Security income tax taxable and raised the Social Security tax, the FICA tax. But your point is really well taken. It's
Thank you.
Without if you're going to force people to work longer, then you've got to offer them some protections. That's brilliant, Marie. Thank you very much for that. I'll remember that. I'll use it someday in a debate. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Feel free.
Okay, good talking to you, Russell in Seattle. Hey, Russell, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Mr. Hartmann, good to talk with you again. I love your show. I listen to it regularly.
Thank you.
The book banning discussion that's been weaving through the show today, I don't think anyone has mentioned this yet, but I missed the early part. The Brooklyn Public Library and the Seattle Public Library are both offering free ebooks to young adults and teenagers from 13 to 26. So it's a way around any book ban within a state or a local area where they live.
Right.
And I wrote a piece on it on the Daily Post.
Oh, great.
And along with that, something that really caught my eye last week was that in Illinois, the governor is about to or has signed banning book ban legislation. It went through the legislature, and it's the first state to ban book bans. The Democratic governor signed
to outlaw book bans. That's great.
Exactly. Yeah, with in the state of Illinois.
God bless the Democrats in Illinois. They are doing doing such great work.
I know, it's incredible, and all the wins that we see when they're daily really feel accumulative now, and need to get better messaging, as is a constant thread on your show as well.
Yeah.
So, thanks for being there, and I wanted to mention that to listeners.
Thank you, Russell. A great public service you just did, and you're absolutely right. I recall reading that in the news. And those libraries are available, so good on you. Thank you, Russell. Appreciate the call. It's 45 minutes past the hour. Shortly, it'll be 46. It's the Thom Hartmann program. Talk media for the rest of us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And I'm picking up your phone calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Jules in St. Louis, Missouri. Hey, Jules, what's on your mind today?
Hi there. Everyone should be forced to listen to your show at least an hour every day.
Bless you, Jules. So what's on your mind?
I got a suggestion if they want to cut costs and cut them drastically. The first thing I would do is I would get rid of revenue sharing.
So define revenue sharing for me.
That's where the blue states support the red states.
Oh, I see.
California,
okay,
New York, and all that. Yeah.
So it's a phrase I hadn't heard in a lot of years. I'm like, wait a minute. Is this what I think it is?
Yeah. There was a guy the Republicans hired a few years back, and I can't remember which Republican presidency it was under. But he taught the Republicans how to rephrase things. In other words, take advantage of people's ignorance.
Yeah.
So,
you're talking Lee Atwater?
No. It was after Lee Atwater.
Oh, Frank Luntz. Did you see Frank Luntz? Just a big news story today. Frank Luntz says that Donald Trump gave him a stroke. That he was feeling numbness creeping up his arm and going across his face. He runs to the hospital. His blood pressure is like 170 over 122, and it was because he was in the middle of a conversation about Donald Trump. Trump gave me a stroke. I call that karma.
He does me the same way. But the more important point, the ignorance is. People that only deal with their own economics, which is called microeconomics, which goes from your kitchen table all the way to the largest of corporations. But the government operates under a different set of rules as a macro or an aggregate economy. And under that, the worse things get, the more money the government has to spend to correct it.
That's true.
So if you try to use the rules of a microeconomy, it would be disastrous in a macroeconomy.
Absolutely right. For example, if I could just make your point, Jules, if they succeed in crashing the economy, saying we're trying to restrain spending, what it's going to do is it's going to increase spending on the interest on the national debt, because the interest rates are going to go up. We're going to have to pay more money to get people to buy our bonds, and it's going to. They're claiming, the Republicans are claiming that they're trying to cut the national debt when in fact they're inflating it.
Exactly, and that's how they take advantage of people with little knowledge. Your knowledge impresses me a great deal. I'm amazed that proper term for it is a polymath. And if you just get a bit of information, a little information is a dangerous thing. And that's how they're manipulating people, because the average MAGA person sitting around the kitchen table figuring out his bills and how to pay them and all that is thinking the federal government operates the same way I do.
Right.
They got to decide which bills to pay. So the Republicans come out looking like geniuses.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a metaphor that they love, and you're absolutely right, Jules. It is completely specious. Jules, thanks a lot for the call and for your kind words. It's 10 minutes before the hour. We'll continue our conversations in just a moment. It's the True People's Media, the Thom Hartmann program. I'll be back with you in 60 seconds. Stay tuned. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting progressive talk radio, and tag you're it. So right-wing billionaires are major funders of the GOP, and the GOP has been promoting basically a death cult. You got Ron DeSantis most recently signing a law that eliminates legal liability for medical professionals who refuse to provide services to people in crisis if it violates their moral, ethical, or religious convictions. The Republican Party has picked up from the Democrats, actually, ironically, weirdly, the old Dixiecrats, the old Southern racists. They used to be Democrats prior to 1964, but then the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and all that. And Nixon came in along in '68 with the Southern strategy, and now they're all Republicans. So why are these right-wing billionaires willing to support this death cult? Is it really just about taxes and deregulation? There's a piece about it at thehartmannreport.com. Check it out. All righty, picking up your calls here. Jonathan in Dumfries, Virginia. Hey, Jonathan, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing, Tom? I don't know, a simple question, but also a very complicated question. Your producer loved it, by the way. How do we respectfully and convincingly let MAGA Republicans know how insane they are?
Typically, the way that I do when maggots call into the program, or when we have them on as guests, is by defining specific issues to discuss. Because in most cases, their arguments just disintegrate when held up to any kind of meaningful scrutiny. Is that what you were talking about? Did I answer your question?
Well, yes, definitely.
They tend to want to do generalities. Biden's a terrible president. That kind of stuff, and you can't argue generalities with people. You have to go to specifics. Yeah,
the problem with specifics is that they don't give a damn about specifics. Facts don't matter.
Well, then you can't argue with them. That's the point at which you have to say, if we're friends or relatives, we're just going to agree not to talk politics, and if we're not friends or relatives, I'll see you later.
Right. Gotcha.
I don't know any alternative. But, if you are going to try to engage with not just a maggot, but, conservatives in general, people who subscribe to some of these bizarre theories and philosophies, the way to do it is to take the issues one at a time and go through them and try to be well informed. And if you lose the argument, go back and do your homework.
There are some conservative viewpoints that I'm not opposed to. And there are some conservatives
for example,
who I actually
to get specific.
Well, let's take the Second Amendment for example. Unfortunately, you can't just make laws about not having guns and not having guns available, because then only outlaws will have guns.
No, that's nonsense.
And those are the people
Yes, outlaws have always had guns, and outlaws are always going to be outlaws. But that doesn't mean that you want to fill the country with guns so much so that the leading cause of death among children now is guns. That's nuts. That's a terrible argument.
I agree with you on that. That's the liberal in me. I completely agree with you on that.
Okay.
But the conservative, the conservative argument, of course, is, well, you can't just take the guns away from everyone. Nobody's trying to take the guns away from everyone. They're just trying to keep the guns out of the bad people's hands.
Well, it's not even a matter of keeping them out of bad people's hands. You're never going to do that either. What you want to do is make sure that if you're going to have guns in your society, if you decide as a society that it is necessary for people to have access to guns, and we made that decision a long time ago. We have hunting, we have target shooting, and we have self-defense, the three main categories for which people buy guns. We have all, collectively across America decided that's okay. Those things are okay. So if you're going to do that, just like we all decided a long time ago, we're going to let people who are over 16 years old drive cars on roads, even though cars can kill people. If you're going to allow people to have guns, then you do it in a way that minimizes the damage to society. And that's, I think the rules that we use for cars is a great example. Prove proficiency in order to get a license, a shooter's license, have liability insurance in case you accidentally kill somebody or even intentionally kill somebody, and have registration of the weapon so that the government knows where it is. So there's some record of who has this so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. But it's pretty straightforward stuff. So anyhow, Jonathan, I need to move along, but thank you for the call. Jesse in Los Angeles. Jesse, I only have about a half a minute left here. You got a quick one, I hope?
Yes, I got a real quick one, Tom. I'm a first-time caller, and I'd like to know, how is it that a judge can have so much power to do something that shuts down the whole nation, like the judge in the Panhandle of Texas?
Yeah, it's a weirdness that has to do with our federal judiciary, and the what's supposed to balance that out, the check against that is the appeals process, the appeals court, and ultimately the Supreme Court. The problem is that the Fifth Circuit Appeals Court has been corrupted itself. But Jesse, your question requires a longer answer that I don't have the time for right now. I'm sorry. But thank you for the call, and I hope you call again. It's great to hear from you on your first call there. Thanks so much for being with us today. Don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. Have a great afternoon. Get out there and walk a mile or two. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free, and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.